Chapter 2093. Blood of the Heavenly Tao. The Tao Defiant had a gloomy expression on his face. He shouldn't have been in such a sorry state with his strength. However, Nguyen had broken through his illusions, and Yao Xiong and the Emperor's spirit had heavily injured him. So, the Tao Defiant's strength had been greatly reduced. Moreover, the ice lotus that was imprinted on his chest was truly strange and powerful. Even if the Tao Defiant was ceaselessly using the energy of his blood vessels, he was still completely frozen by the terrifying cold energy of the ice lotus. I never expected that there would be such a hidden door. You really are shrewd. The corners of Zhuowen's mouth curled up slightly, and then he clenched his right hand, causing a clump of flames to burn at the center of his palm. This cluster of flames was a powerful flame that the black-clothed Zhuowen had condensed after surviving 10 fires. Even though it wasn't enough to resist the cold energy of the ice lotus, it was more than enough to protect Zhuowen from being affected by the cold energy. Zhuowen glanced at the martyr who was walking slowly towards him from the open space before him. The corners of his mouth curled up into a cold smile, and then his gaze descended onto the hidden door. The hidden door had restrictions within it, and he had to break through the restrictions in order to activate it. The restrictions on the door weren't complicated, so Zhuowen was able to break through them completely after pondering for a while. He dared to activate the door before the martyr arrived. The door closed, and Zhuowen felt a wave of weightlessness. He knew that the door was moving upward swiftly. It didn't take long for the feeling of weightlessness to vanish, and then the door stopped moving. After that, it opened once more. Zhuowen didn't pay any attention to the Tao Defiant who was sealed in ice, and he just walked out of the door. There was an enormous hall before the hidden door. There were 12 enormous stone pillars within the hall, and every single one of them burned with blue flames. The entire hall was dark blue, and it seemed rather strange. There were 2 enormous holes that were shaped like eyes at the end of the hall, and there was a high platform made of white jade at the center of the 2 holes. The platform was 15 m tall, and there were 4 sharp corners at the top of the platform that supported a golden disc. Zhuowen probed with his divine sense and found that there was a drop of blue liquid in the middle of the golden disc. However, the moment Zhuowen's spiritual consciousness came into contact with the blue liquid, Zhuowen's spiritual consciousness instantly collapsed. In an instant, Zhuowen's extended divine sense collapsed. Even the divine soul galaxy in Zhuowen's divine soul space collapsed one after another. Zhuowen gulped down a mouthful of heavenly domain starry sky essence to calm himself down. However, what made Zhuowen break out in a cold sweat was that even after he had taken the heavenly domain starry sky essence and restored his soul to its peak, the collapsing power still raged in his spiritual space. In desperation, Zhuowen could only continue to drink the heavenly domain starry sky essence and endure the severe pain caused by the collapse of his soul. This collapse lasted for a full 4 hours before it gradually disappeared. Zhuowen, on the other hand, was powerless and limp on the ground. His forehead was covered in cold sweat, and his back was completely soaked in sweat. What the hell is this? How can it be so terrifying? Zhuowen had a lingering fear, and his heartbeat was even more chaotic. The moment his divine sense probed the blue liquid, he discovered that it contained an extremely terrifying energy. This energy was not material, but it contained a kind of law. This kind of law was extremely overbearing. It was even more terrifying than the starry sky law that the black-clothed Zhuowen had encountered during his 20th lightning disaster. Blood of the way of heaven? Zhuowen narrowed his eyes and muttered softly. The black-clothed Zhuowen had heard the Defiant mention the blood of the way of heaven when he had turned into dust and hidden at the entrance of the Luo God Palace. As for what the blood of the way of heaven was for, Zhuowen had no idea. However, after sensing the terrifying power of the law contained in the blood of the way of heaven, Zhuowen knew that this thing was definitely not ordinary. Zhuowen even guessed that Yao Xiong and the king's spirit had come all the way to the Luo God Palace ruins for the blood of the way of heaven. I have already entered the Luo God Palace to look for the sun and moon grass. I will keep the blood of the way of heaven for now. As for its specific use, I will see if I can get some information from Yao Xiong. The black-clothed Zhuowen's eyes flashed. He decided to keep the blood of the way of heaven first. Of course, the power of the law on the blood of the way of heaven was too terrifying. It would not be easy for Zhuan to take the blood of the way of heaven. After taking a deep breath, the black-clothed Zhuan slowly walked toward the white jade platform. What a powerful law! Zhuan's eyes narrowed. The moment he got close to the white jade platform, Zhuan realized that the power of the law emitted by the blood of the way of heaven was like thousands of mountains crushing his body. As Zhuan walked, he used indestructible yellow, and his body was covered in yellow light. Indestructible yellow was something that Zhuan had obtained from the Taiching Wonderland's Hidden Scriptures Pavilion. Of course, in other words, it was a top-tier virtual heaven superpower that Taiching had given him. This superpower was divided into 5 levels: acquired, innate, Qianjun, Wanxiang, and indestructible yellow. Zhuan had already cultivated to the 4th level, Wanxiang. The yellow light around him turned into shadows of divine elephants. There were close to 10,000 of them, and it was impossible to count them all. With Devour's body and the indestructible dark and yellow indestructible art, Zhuowen's body had reached an unprecedented level. Even so, Zhuowen's body was crushed by the power of the blood of the way of heaven. His body made cracking sounds, as if all his bones were dislocated and shattered. Zhuowen's eyes were firm. He was not afraid of the pain of his bones being crushed. He walked forward without hesitation. As Zhuan got closer to the white jade platform, the pressure became more and more terrifying. Crack! With a crisp sound, Zhuan spat out a mouthful of blood. The bones in his right foot were broken, and he knelt on the ground, unable to get up. Zhuan frowned. He immediately took the heavenly star essence and continued to walk forward. Then, the sound of bones breaking rose and fell. Zhuowen's feet, hands, body, and even his skull couldn't bear the horrible pressure and kept shattering. However, Zhuan was firm. He didn't give in to the pain. Instead, he took the heavenly star essence and struggled to recover his broken bones. This strange cycle lasted for 3 days. Yun also endured this inhuman pain for 3 days and 3 nights. Finally, the yellow light around Zhuowen's body suddenly flourished. The divine elephant phantoms around him let out a long cry and actually merged into the yellow light. The yellow light became more vigorous and dense. Eventually, the entire hall was filled with yellow light. Even the light of the blue fire pillars on the stone pillars of the hall was covered by the yellow light. All the bones in Zhuowen's body recovered, and he stood up once again. At this moment, the terrifying pressure exerted on his body could no longer affect him in the slightest. Under the pressure of the rule power of the heavenly blood, my indestructible yellow finally broke through from the 4th level of all creation realm to the 5th level of indestructible yellow. Zhuowen's eyes were full of excitement. He didn't expect that he would be able to cultivate the indestructible yellow to the peak completion realm under such circumstances. It was really beyond his expectation. Letting out a long laugh, Zhuowen leaped up and easily arrived at the foot of the high platform. He raised his head slightly and looked at the gilded disc supported by the high platform. He grinned and said, "The blood of heavenly Tao is truly terrifying, but it still can't escape from my palm." With that, Zhuowen opened his hand, grabbed the gilded disc, and slowly took it down. At the same time, Zhuowen's right hand was collapsing. In just a blink of an eye, his hand had disappeared. Zhuowen didn't panic. He swallowed the heavenly star essence and used his good left hand to hold the gilded disc. He had expected that the heavenly blood would be so horrible. If the heavenly blood could put him in such a difficult situation, it would be strange if he touched the heavenly blood with his hand. I wonder if Devour's inner world can hold the heavenly blood? Zhuan was hesitant. Normally, Devour's inner world was the toughest object that Zhuan had ever seen, and it could hold everything in the world. However, the heavenly blood wasn't ordinary. He was worried that Devour's inner world would collapse because of it. Anyway, except for Devour's inner world, Zhuan didn't have a good place to store the heavenly blood. However, since this white jade platform could hold the heavenly blood for such a long time without being damaged, it wasn't simple at all. Zhuowen's eyes fell on the white jade platform. Putting the gilded disc aside, Zhuan touched the white jade platform with his right hand. He found that the surface of the white jade platform was as smooth as mutton fat, and there was nothing special about it. Let's try it first. Zhuowen's right hand turned into a knife, cutting the white jade platform in half. Then he cut off a piece of white jade that was several feet long and wide. His right hand turned into a claw, grabbing the front of the white jade to make it as big as the gilded disc. Carefully putting the gilded disc into the white jade, Yuan used another piece of white jade to make a sealed lid, completely sealing the gilded disc inside. To Zhuowen's surprise, after the white jade lid was sealed, the intimidating pressure from the heavenly blood disappeared. This white jade is really useful. Zhuowen was pleasantly surprised. He had inspected the white jade many times and found that it was just an ordinary piece of jade. However, this ordinary piece of jade was actually able to seal the heavenly Tao blood. Chapter 2094. The whereabouts of the sun-moon grass. Zhuowen walked over to the secret door and stared at the Tao Defiant who was frozen by the ice lotus. He said indifferently, "Tell me about the blood of the heaven Tao." The Tao Defiant laughed with ridicule. "Are you joking? What's in it for me? Could it be that you'll let me go?" As he spoke, the Tao Defiant's eyes suddenly turned extremely white, and he stared coldly at Sun. In an instant, the space in the surroundings warped while the entire world seemed to have been shattered into pieces. But in next to no time, the warped energy was blasted into pieces by an even more domineering and terrifying divine sense. The Tao Defiant's expression changed drastically, and then he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. He stared fixedly at Zhuan and cried out in a sharp voice, How could your divine sense be so formidable?" Zhuowen's gaze was cold as he said, "You still intend to use illusions against me? I can tell you clearly that since I've destroyed your illusions once, they're unable to affect me at all." After the baptism of the phaseless formation, Zhuowen's soul had become extremely terrifying, and there were over 1,000 soul galaxies within his soul space. It could be said that Zhuowen's soul space was equivalent to a small-scale heaven domain, even though it was still quite far away from a true heaven domain. However, Zhuan believed that so long as the number of soul galaxies within his soul space increased incessantly, then his soul space would really be able to expand to the point of being comparable to a heaven domain. If that day really came, then Zhuowen's soul would probably be so strong that it could rival a supreme expert who ascended the 9th step of the void realm. Of course, all of this was just Zhuowen's guess, and it was still unknown whether his soul space could transform into a heaven domain. At this moment, the Tao Defiant had an extremely unsightly expression on his face. He really had intended to use illusions to deceive Zhuowen. So long as he deceived Zhuowen for an instant, then he would be able to control Zhuowen and take the ice lotus from him. Unfortunately, the Tao Defiant's illusions were completely useless against Yun. "Speak. If you tell me the truth about the effects of the heavenly Tao blood, I might spare your life. Of course, you can choose not to tell me. When I leave the Luotian Palace ruins, I'm sure I'll be able to find out more about the blood of the heavenly Tao," Zhuowen said calmly. The Tao Defiant's expression changed drastically. His gaze flickered while he revealed hesitation. In the end, he gritted his teeth and said, "I can tell you about the blood of the heaven Tao, but you have to swear on your life that you'll absolutely not harm me." Zhuowen nodded and said, "Sure." The Tao Defiant heaved a sigh of relief while Zhuowen noticed a wisp of a sly smile on the corners of the Tao Defiant's mouth. However, he didn't really mind it and just waited for the Tao Defiant to continue. The Tao Defiant spoke tirelessly about the effects of the blood of the heaven Tao. After listening, Yun fell into silence. As it turned out, the heavenly Tao blood was a trace of the heavenly Tao law that Luotian had condensed when she ascended the 9 steps of the void sky. The Tao Defiants and Tao Martyrs were formed because of the blood of the heaven Tao. Powerful starry sky laws existed in the vast and boundless starry sky. The starry sky laws were invisible and immaterial. They were everywhere and scattered in every corner of the starry sky. It was said that besides the starry sky laws, there was another type of law that was above the starry sky laws, and this law was called the heavenly Tao. The heavenly Tao was even more illusory and indescribable. Void sky cultivators could sense the starry sky laws, and the stronger their cultivation, the clearer they could sense the starry sky laws. However, the heavenly Tao was ethereal and immaterial. Even those who ascended the 8 steps of the void sky couldn't comprehend the so-called starry sky laws. For example, The starry sky laws existed in the starry sky where the heaven domain was located. However, the heavenly Tao was the law of the enormous universe that was formed by the 8 heaven domains and the starry sky outside the realm. It was of a much higher level than the starry sky laws. The blood of the heavenly Tao was a trace of the heavenly Tao's law. It was unknown how Luotian had obtained it. With the blood of the heavenly Tao, void sky cultivators could comprehend the heavenly Tao law within the blood of the heavenly Tao. If they could comprehend this trace of heavenly Tao law and integrate it into their body, void sky 8 steps cultivators could easily comprehend life and death and step onto the 9th step of the void sky bridge. Zhuowen's eyes flashed, but his heart was pounding. He knew very well that once the blood of the heavenly Tao was leaked, many old monsters who usually didn't come out would come out of seclusion and crazily snatch the blood of the heavenly Tao. It seems that Yao Xiong and Di Ling's goal is the blood of the heavenly Tao. If they don't find the blood of the heavenly Tao, they will definitely suspect me. If the news that I have the blood of the heavenly Tao spreads, I will become the enemy of the entire world. I can't let this happen. Zhuan calmed down and thought of the scene when the heavenly domain's starry sky essence was exposed. His heart turned cold. Although the heavenly domain's starry sky essence was precious, compared to the blood of the heavenly Tao, it was like heaven and earth. At that time, the heavenly domain's starry sky essence had caused Zhuan to be pursued by countless forces in the star field. If others knew that he had the blood of the heavenly Tao, the forces of the entire great Brahma domain wouldn't let him go. When he thought of the danger of the blood of the heavenly Tao being leaked, Zhuowen's eyes were filled with cold, killing intent. He knew that Yao Xiong and Di Ling had to die here just in case. Otherwise, it would be dangerous in the end. The Tao Defiant looked at Zhuowen's changing expression and was slightly worried. His life and death were closely related to the blood of the heavenly Tao. If the blood of the heavenly Tao disappeared, then he, the Tao Defiant, and those martyrs would return to dust and cease to exist. The blood of the heavenly Tao is the lifeline of you and those martyrs, right? If a strand of the blood of the heavenly Tao is used, then you will die, right? Is that why you made me swear not to harm you? Zhuan narrowed his eyes and said coldly. The Tao Defiant's heart shook, and he said in a low voice, "The blood of the heavenly Tao is my lifeline. Could it be that I have to sacrifice myself? Survival is the instinct of every living being. You have the right and so do I. Is there anything wrong with what I did?" Perhaps he felt that his tone was too unyielding, so the Tao Defiant slowed down and said, "Actually, the blood of the heavenly Tao doesn't have to be absorbed. The blood of the heavenly Tao is a trace of the laws of the heavenly Tao. Even a cultivator at the peak of the 8th step of the void heaven realm might be crushed to death by the laws of the heavenly Tao if he absorbs it by force. Moreover, if your comprehension ability is high enough, then you just have to rely on the blood of the heavenly Tao to assist you. Along with the passage of time, you might be able to comprehend the laws of the heavenly Tao on your own and comprehend life and death. After all, there's a huge difference between absorbing the blood of the heavenly Tao and comprehending life and death on their own. Supposedly, Lord Brahma absorbed the blood of the heavenly Tao to attain the 9th step of the void heaven realm, and he was the weakest amongst the lords of the 8 great heaven realms. The Tao Defiant revealed a trace of disdain and contempt when he spoke about Lord Brahma. Obviously, the Tao Defiant looked down upon Lord Brahma, who'd become the lord of the great heaven realm. Zhuan gazed at the Tao Defiant with slight surprise. No matter how weak Lord Brahma was, he was still an expert at the 9th step of the void heaven realm, and even if he'd advanced by absorbing the blood of the heavenly Tao, he was still extremely formidable. Yet this mere Tao Defiant actually looked down upon Lord Brahma, and it aroused Zhuowen's curiosity. The Tao Defiant noticed Zhuowen's curiosity as well, and he said indifferently, "If you promise me that you won't absorb the blood of the heavenly Tao, then I can tell you the entire truth of what happened all those years ago. Moreover, I'll even tell you about the other use of the blood of the heavenly Tao." Zhuowen's eyes flickered. Even though he was rather curious about the enmity between Luotian and Lord Brahma, it wasn't to the extent of making him give up his desire for the blood of the heavenly Tao. However, the other use of the blood of the heavenly Tao that the Tao Defiant spoke of had completely aroused Zhuowen's interest. After giving it some thought, Zhuan said, "I can agree, but I have conditions. The Tao Defiant frowned. Tell me about them. Zhuan spoke indifferently. My condition is to help me seal up the ruins of Luotian Palace and kill that emperor spirit and Yao Xiong that entered the ruins. The Tao Defiant thought for a moment and laughed coldly. Looks like you're afraid that the rumors of the blood of the heavenly Tao will spread. It's an extraordinary treasure, and you'll become the enemy of the entire world once others find out about it. Zhuan spoke coldly. You talk a lot of nonsense. Do you agree or not? The Tao Defiant nodded and said, Of course. Those two fellows schemed against me as well, so I would get even with them even if you didn't tell me. However, they aren't simple figures, so I have the right to retreat if anything goes wrong. All right. Do you know where the Sun Moon Herb is? Zhuan took a deep breath and finally asked the question that had been on his mind for a long time. He hadn't come to the Waning Moon ruins for the blood of the heavenly Tao. In fact, he'd only found out about the blood of the heavenly Tao after a long time. His main objective was the Yin-Yang herb. The Tao Defiant glanced indifferently at Zhuo, and he wasn't surprised at all. He said, There's only a single Sun Moon herb in Luotian Palace, and it was taken a few tens of thousands of years ago. Myrtle Star Monarch? Zhuo's eyes narrowed as he thought of Myrtle Star Monarch. Yun Chuyu had said that Myrtle Star Monarch had entered the Waning Moon ruins tens of thousands of years ago and taken a Sun Moon herb. Since the map he'd obtained was of the Luotian Palace ruins, it meant that the only Sun Moon herb had probably been taken by Myrtle Star Monarch. Yun Chuyu had said that Myrtle Star Monarch had used up the Sun Moon herb, so when he met Myrtle Star Monarch in the Tower of Hanner, he didn't ask him about the Sun Moon herb. Is there really no other Sun Moon herb in the Waning Moon ruins? Zhuan asked through gritted teeth. Chapter 2095. Luotian Orizhuowen looked excited. As long as there was a clue about the sun and moon grass, he would go in regardless of whether it was dangerous or not. After all, it was the key to whether Mu Chenxue could wake up. Of course, before he left Luotian Palace, he had to completely eliminate the two uncertain factors, Yao Xiong and Di Ling. Now, you should tell me about what happened back then and the other use of the blood of the Wei, right? Zhuan asked the Tao Defiant. The Tao Defiant nodded, and then he spoke in a low voice. Let me tell you why Lord Luotian perished all those years ago. I presume you've heard about the incident that occurred in Luotian Palace a few million years ago, right? I know. Luotian Palace was destroyed because of Great Brahma, and Lord Luotian died because of him. Zhuo nodded. Great Brahma used the blood of the Wei to reach the 9 steps void sky, while Lord Luotian comprehended the way of heaven and understood life and death. In terms of strength, Lord Luotian was stronger than Great Brahma. Back then, when Lord Luotian challenged many experts in the star field, it attracted the attention of Great Brahma. Especially after Lord Luotian advanced to the void sky 9th step, Great Brahma summoned Lord Luotian. Although I don't know what Great Brahma said to Lord Luotian, I'm sure it was nothing good. After returning from Great Brahma Palace, Lord Luotian had been in seclusion. Since Lord Luotian was the second expert in the Great Brahma domain to reach the 9 steps void sky, Luotian Palace developed very quickly. It surpassed the 10 great sects in the star domain and approached Great Brahma Palace. However, Lord Luotian was always in seclusion and rarely cared about Luotian Palace's affairs. She also didn't agree to the suggestion of Luotian Palace's higher-ups to enter the star domain and expand their influence. Speaking of this, the Tao Defiant sighed and said, At that time, my status in Luotian Palace wasn't high. I was just lucky to become the gatekeeper of Lord Luotian's seclusion and do some errands. Lord Luotian was very good. Although she had unparalleled power, she never put on airs. She treated all the disciples of Luotian Palace equally. Lord Luotian Palace was no exception. However, what happened later completely destroyed Luotian Palace. The Tao Defiant's eyes were spitting fire as he said hoarsely, Lord Luotian finally came out of seclusion, but for some reason she was blind. Later on, I learned that Great Brahma was summoning Lord Luotian to the Great Brahma Palace to impart a secret technique to Lord Luotian. It is said that this secret technique can consolidate the void sky 9 steps. Of Luotian's was, and that bastard, Lord Brahma, came to Luotian Palace at this time and suppressed Lord Luotian. In the end, the two of them fought. It was a terrifying battle. The entire far west was transformed into ruins. Galaxies were obliterated. In the end, the far west was reduced to its current state. It's covered in a terrifying magnetic field. No matter how powerful a cultivator's soul is, it's still possible for them to get lost in the far west. Zhuowen's eyes flickered. He hadn't expected that the dignified Lord of Brahma region, Lord Brahma, would actually plot to harm Luotian. Wasn't that a little too despicable? Zhuowen asked in a low voice, "Is Luotian dead?" Since Luotian had relied on herself to attain the 9 steps of void heaven, then she definitely had her own unique abilities. Zhuowen felt that such an expert probably wouldn't perish so easily. The Tao Defiant spoke in a slightly sorrowful tone. "Lord Luotian is dead." Zhuowen frowned slightly and asked again, "Are you sure?" The Tao Defiant nodded and fell silent. It seemed like he was truly immersed in sorrow and was unable to extricate himself. "Now, tell me about the uses of the blood of the Heaven Tao." Zhuowen spoke in a low voice. Even though Zhuowen still had doubts about Luotian's fate, since the Tao Defiant was so certain, then it was useless even if he doubted it. He could only make guesses according to what the Tao Defiant said. The Tao Defiant sized up Zhuowen and said seriously, "You have the ancient sword Saint King's King Sword, right?" Zhuowen was stunned, and then he thought of the broken sword he'd obtained from the ancient sword tomb. Could it be that the King's Sword the Tao Defiant spoke of is that broken sword? When he thought up to this point, Zhuowen withdrew the broken sword. At that moment, the broken sword had been restored to its original state. Although its surface was still covered in rust, it looked much better than before. Zhuowen had obtained the other half of the broken sword from a martyr. At that time, he'd wondered why the other half of the King's Sword would be with a martyr in the Luotian Palace ruins. Now that the Tao Defiant had mentioned it, Zhuowen had some guesses. The Tao Defiant glanced deeply at the King's Sword and spoke solemnly, "It really is the ancient sword Saint King's King Sword. Looks like you're extraordinary since you were able to obtain the King's Sword." Zhuowen spoke coldly, "What does the blood of the Heaven Tao have to do with the King's Sword?" The Tao Defiant didn't panic at all and continued, "Do you know the relationship between the ancient sword Saint King and Lord Luotian?" Zhuowen shook his head and waited for the Tao Defiant to continue. The Tao Defiant smiled faintly. The ancient sword Saint King was the strongest person in the far west before Lord Luotian. He was a peerless figure who had ascended 8 times. Unfortunately, his lifespan was limited, and he died of old age in the end. Not long after the ancient sword Saint King died of old age, Lord Luotian rose to prominence, and Lord Luotian was actually the ancient sword Saint King's only bloodline. Zhuowen's eyes narrowed. "So that's how it is. No wonder I was able to find the other half of the King's Sword in Luotian Palace. So it turns out that Luotian and the ancient sword Saint King have such a close relationship." The Tao Defiant said, "The blood of the Heaven Tao contains Lord Luotian's aura. So long as you utilize this aura, you'll be able to subdue the King's Sword. At that time, you'll be able to easily comprehend a formidable secret technique like the Thousand Sword Rain." Zhuowen laughed coldly. "I've obtained the Thousand Sword Rain a long time ago. So long as I'm given a certain amount of time, it's only a matter of time before I fully comprehend it." The Tao Defiant ridiculed him instead. "You'll die once you've fully comprehended the Rain of Thousand Swords. The Thousand Sword Rain contains the ancient sword Saint King's will. If he notices that it isn't his descendant that cultivates the Thousand Sword Rain, then the ancient sword Saint King's will annihilate that cultivator." Zhuowen shuddered. If the Tao Defiant was telling the truth, then he really was in danger. Although Zhuowen's soul was much more powerful than other cultivators of the void sky, the ancient sword Saint King was an existence that had reached the peak of the void sky. Zhuowen knew very well just how powerful the will of an existence like that was. If his soul was directly struck by the will of such an existence, it was very likely that his soul would collapse. It would be extremely dangerous. The King's Sword is a sword that the ancient sword Saint King forged his entire life. Do you think he'll be so kind as to allow an outsider to obtain such an important sword? The Tao Defiant continued. "Moreover, I can tell you clearly that once the King's Sword acknowledges you as a descendant of the ancient sword Saint King, You'll possess all the ancient swords that the ancient sword Saint King forged his entire life. Zhuowen's eyes flickered. He was rather tempted by the Tao Defiant's words, but he was unable to confirm how much of the Tao Defiant was telling the truth. How do I use the presence within the blood of the heavenly Tao? Zhuowen continued with his questions. He knew that what the Tao Defiant had said earlier was completely unnecessary. How to use the presence within the blood of the heavenly Tao was the crux of the matter. I can help you extract the presence of the blood of the heavenly Tao. Since I evolved into a Tao Defiant because of the blood of the heavenly Tao, the pressure from the laws of the blood of the heavenly Tao doesn't affect me too much. I can come into contact with the blood of the heavenly Tao. That's your only way, said the Tao Defiant. Zhuowen fell silent. It was impossible for him to feel at ease letting the Tao Defiant come into contact with the blood of the heavenly Tao. The Tao Defiant continued, I know you're worried about me, but I can swear that if you're still worried after that, then just pretend I didn't say anything. In any case, I've said everything I needed to say. The decision is in your hands. Zhuowen remained silent. He waved his sleeve, causing flames to blaze as he removed the ice lotus from the Tao Defiant. At the same time, he opened the white jade box that contained the blood of the heavenly Tao and revealed the dark blue blood within it. Zhuowen placed the ice lotus by the side of the box, and then terrifying cold energy instantly froze the box. However, the blood of the heavenly Tao was too terrifying, so it wasn't affected by the cold energy of the ice lotus at all. Zhuowen spoke indifferently, Now, you can try to extract the aura of the Luo god from the blood of the heavenly Tao. The Tao Defiant took a deep and long glance at Zhuowen. Needless to say, Zhuowen's method was really good. The terrifying cold energy of the ice lotus had frozen the box on the ground, so the Tao Defiant wouldn't be able to do anything even if he had any ill intentions. The Tao Defiant slowly walked over to the blood of the heavenly Tao. The terrifying pressure of the laws emanated by the blood of the heavenly Tao really was completely useless against him. Zhuowen stared fixedly at the Tao Defiant as he was on guard against the Tao Defiant's actions. However, the Tao Defiant was extremely obedient and didn't do anything inappropriate. He just formed seals with his hands and really did start to extract the aura of the blood of the heavenly Tao. After around 4 hours of time passed, the Tao Defiant took a few steps back. There was a ball of dark blue energy at the center of his palm, and it seemed to be rather strange. This is Lord Luo God's aura. You just have to fuse it into your body, and then you'll possess Lord Luo God's aura. At that time, you'll be able to completely control the Imperial Sword and possess the qualifications to control the countless ancient swords of the ancient sword Saint King. The Tao Defiant passed the ball of energy to Zhuowen. Chapter 2096. Designed to... What? The Tao Defiant glared angrily at Zhuowen when he sensed his entire body turn icy cold and stiff, and he couldn't help but shout in a sharp voice. Zhuowen spoke indifferently, because I don't trust you. The Tao Defiant was furious. Shua, I helped you out of the kindness of my heart, yet you actually doubt me. Are you even human? Zhuowen just laughed coldly and remained silent. He just stared silently at the Tao Defiant, and his gaze grew colder and colder. It caused chills to run down the Tao Defiant's spine while he broke out in cold sweat. The Tao Defiant fell silent, and then he said coldly, If you don't want to put yourself in danger, then there's another way, and that's to mix your aura with Lord Luotian's aura. After that, you don't have to absorb the aura into your body, and you just have to let it coil around your body and disguise yourself. However, there are quite a few flaws in this method. I wonder if King's sword will be able to see through it. Zhuowen glanced coldly at the Tao Defiant. He knew that the Tao Defiant hadn't told him about this method on purpose. He guessed that absorbing the aura into his body would probably cause quite a bit of side effects. Otherwise, the Tao Defiant wouldn't want him, Zhuowen, to use such a method. Zhuowen paid no further attention to the Tao Defiant, and his gaze descended onto the ball of dark blue energy in his hand instead. After that, a ball of white energy gradually rose up from his empty right hand. It was the aura that Zhuowen had extracted from himself. After that, Zhuowen crossed his hands together, and then the white and blue balls of energy started to revolve towards each other. They gradually sped up and fused into one in the end. As their auras mixed together, Yuan noticed that his aura had started to assimilate with Luotian's aura, and then their auras were ceaselessly neutralized. When the aura reached a balance, Zhuowen combined this new aura into a ball of gauze, covering the surface of his body. After that, he touched King's sword with his right hand. Although the King's sword was forcibly suppressed by Zhuowen, the sword spirit of the King's sword was proud and arrogant. It did not put Zhuowen in its eyes and was unruly. It was simply wishful thinking for Zhuowen to want the King's sword to recognize him as its master. However, things were different now. Zhuowen's aura was mixed with Luotian's aura, which made the sword spirit of the King's sword feel a trace of familiarity. It could feel that this was the aura of its master's bloodline back then. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Wang Jian let out a mournful sword cry, then flew over and floated in front of Jun. Then, it continued to revolve around Jun, as if it was whispering its difficulties. Zhuowen reached out and gently stroked Wang Jian. The latter did not refuse, which made Zhuowen happy. Before this, he had also wanted to touch this King's sword, but every time, his arm was almost cut off. Later on, he lost interest and gave up. Seeing that the King's sword was no longer resisting him, Yuan became bolder and began to try to refine the King's sword. Perhaps sensing Zhuowen's intentions, the King's sword struggled a little. However, after sensing Luotian's aura, the King's sword hesitated and did not resist. Yuan was overjoyed. He quickly increased his strength and completely refined the King's sword. Yuan sat in the hall for 3 days and 3 nights. After 3 days, Yuan suddenly opened his eyes. The rusty King's sword turned into a stream of light and circled around Zhuowen's body. It looked extremely intimate and obedient. Zhuowen looked at the King's sword in front of him with joy. The corner of his mouth curled up as he muttered to himself, "Finally, the King's sword has been completely refined." Moreover, the sword manipulation technique, Thousand Sword Rain, was also completely comprehended the moment the King's sword was successfully refined. This is incredible. Putting away the King's sword, Yuan was very excited. The moment he refined the King's sword, he could clearly sense the ancient sword tomb, which was far away from the Luotian palace ruins. There were more than 9,000 ancient swords stuck in the ancient sword tomb. In fact, if Zhuowen wanted to, he could mobilize the over 9,000 ancient swords. However, the Luotian palace ruins were completely sealed. Even if he could move those 9,000 ancient swords, it would be useless. Putting away the ice lotus, Yuan looked at the defiant and said, "Now, help me kill Yao Xiong and the King's spirit. Otherwise, if I die, the sky path blood will be taken by those two. When that happens, I cannot guarantee that they will let you go." The defiant moved his limbs and said, "Don't worry. There are some things that I know better than you. This is why I want to cooperate with you. But you have to be careful of Yao Xiong. He is a guy who hides very well." Zhuowen nodded, and then he left with the Tao Defiance. He had the blood of the Heaven Tao in his possession, so the Tao Defiance and Martyrs could only be led by the nose by him. He wasn't afraid of them acting against him unless the Tao Defiance intended to take him down with them. In the ruins of the Luotian palace, most of the walls were broken, as well as some remnant arrays. Suddenly, at the end of a corridor, there was the sound of hurried footsteps. Then, 2 tall figures appeared. "Brother Yao, we seem to have lost him." The King's spirit narrowed his eyes and snorted coldly. Yao Xiong shook his head and pretended to smile mysteriously. "That Zhuowen is very cunning. We actually didn't lose him." As he spoke, Yao Xiong took out a palm-sized jar and smashed it. Suddenly, a terrifying, dense dark green mist gushed out from the jar. The dark green mist spread extremely quickly. In an instant, the entire corridor was filled with dark green mist. The mist was very strange. Wherever it passed, it would corrode and corrode. The smell was very unpleasant. It was so bad that it made people want to vomit. "Brother D, take this pill. This is the antidote for the poison. If you don't take it first, I'm afraid you will be poisoned." Yao Xiong took out a green pill and gave it to the King's spirit. The King's spirit took the pill and looked hesitant. In the end, he swallowed it. As soon as he swallowed the pill, the King's spirit's discomfort disappeared. He knew it was the antidote that had helped him. "The poison is so strong. I don't believe Zhuowen can last long," the King's spirit said coldly. Yao Xiong and the King's spirit had been in the Luotian Palace ruins for 5 or 6 days. They had been searching for a long time, but they had not found any clues about the Sky Path blood. They had not even found any other treasures. The two of them had suspected that Zhuo Wen, who had arrived first, had obtained the items in the ruins. Therefore, they had desperately searched for Zhuo Wen in the ruins. 4 to 6 hours ago, the two of them had encountered Zhuo Wen in this passageway. However, Zhuo Wen was swift, and he'd already fled towards the depths of the passageway at an extremely swift speed before the two of them could approach. What made the two of them gnash their teeth even more was that Zhuo Wen seemed to be very familiar with the ruins. In the twists and turns of the passageway, he instantly disappeared. In order to expose Zhuo Wen, Yao Xiong decided to use an extreme method, which was to release the poison mist. The poison mist was terrible. Once a cultivator was poisoned by it, they would not die immediately. Instead, they would be paralyzed and unable to move. As time passed, the poison would become stronger and stronger. Eventually, it would reach deep into the cultivator's body and corrode the illusory bridge. Furthermore, the poison mist was very diffuse. Although the passageway was deep, with the characteristics of the poison mist, it could cover the entire passageway and its depths for tens of thousands of meters. Yao Xiong guessed that this passageway was at most 10,000 meters long. At that time, Zhuo Wen would be helpless against the poisonous fog. He could only sit and wait for death, waiting for the two of them to find him. Following the poison mist, the two of them went deep into the Luotian Palace ruins. The corridor extended in all directions. A few hundred meters ahead, there were more than 10 branches. "Let's split up and search," the King's spirit suddenly suggested. Yao Xiong thought for a moment and nodded. He did not reject the King's spirit's suggestion. The two of them each chose 2 corridors and quickly disappeared into the corridors. After the two of them entered their respective corridors, 2 figures walked out from behind them. One of them was a young man in a black robe surrounded by demonic mist. The other person was very strange. His flesh was transparent, and dense blood vessels could be seen deep in his body. The two of them split up. "Which one do you want to deal with first?" The defiant looked at the black-robed Zhuo Wen and asked in a low voice. "Let's kill the King's spirit first. This guy is very lucky. The corridor he chose is the one my main body entered." Zhuo Wen grinned, then led the Tao Defiance into the passageway that the King's spirits had entered. On the other hand, the Tao Defiance led over 10 martyrs to follow closely behind Zhuo Wen. Even though the martyrs were slow, their combat strengths were extremely formidable. Especially when they were under the control of the Tao Defiance, their strengths had become even more terrifying. "I hope my luck is better than Yao Xiong's. If I meet Zhuo Wen earlier, I can get the heavenly blood and leave the Luo God Palace ruins as soon as possible." The King's spirit flew quickly in the corridor. Thinking of Yao Xiong's various miraculous methods, the King's spirit was extremely afraid. Although the King's spirit's cultivation was higher than Yao Xiong's, he knew that Yao Xiong had many more trump cards. Once he stood up, the King's spirit was not confident that he could defeat Yao Xiong. In the King's spirit's heart, Yao Xiong was too mysterious. We've reached the end already?" The King's spirit suddenly stopped and looked at the wall in front of him. He frowned. However, when he saw a figure lying on the cliff in front of him, his frown completely relaxed, and he even laughed out loud. "Ha! It seems that the heavens are helping me. I randomly chose a corridor and I met Zhuo Wen." The figure lying on the ground was Zhuo Wen's main body, dressed in white. Chapter 2097. Real or fake? The King's spirit was overjoyed as he stared at Zhuo Wen, who was lying on the ground. It's really effortless to obtain it." The King's spirit suppressed his joy and walked over to Zhuo Wen. However, the King's spirit did not let his guard down. As he walked over, he scanned Zhuo Wen to make sure Zhuo Wen was not poisoned. After confirming that it was Zhuo Wen, the King's spirit clawed at Zhuo Wen's body. Peng! The King's spirit grabbed Zhuo Wen's body and heard a muffled noise. The King's spirit was surprised to find that Zhuo Wen was no longer in his hand, but a pile of rubble. Is this an illusion? The King's spirit knew this was not good, so he quickly retreated. But before he could get far, a muffled noise came from behind him, followed by a powerful force acting on his back. With a grunt, the king's spirit came to a stop. It was then that he realized there was an invisible ripple around him. Trap and kill array. Jun, did you trick me? The king's spirit's eyes were cold, and he roared. Suddenly, a black fog erupted from his body. Countless bolts of black lightning emerged from the black fog, and the sound of a horse's hooves could be heard. An incomparably handsome black horse rushed out from the black fog. The horse's hooves carried rolling black thunder. Its aura was like a rainbow, and its momentum was vast and mighty. The king's spirit jumped on the black horse, and black lightning surrounded his body. It turned into a black armor, and in his right hand, black lightning emerged to form a 3-meter-long halberd. The black horse roared at the sky. Its hooves were like the wind. In an instant, it disappeared from its original spot like a bolt of lightning. Soon after, the surrounding formless ripples formed a death trap array that was completely destroyed. The moment the trap and kill array was destroyed, the king's spirit saw Zhuowen coming towards him. Zhuowen held the glorious amethyst galaxy divine sword in his right hand while the 48 no-beginning demonic golden swords circled around him. You want to die? The king's spirit laughed coldly and swung his halberd. The black horse under his feet followed the king's spirit's lead and dashed forward. The black horse's momentum and the king's spirit's arm strength made the halberd's attack look magnificent. The space around it shattered, and the wind was like a tsunami. The heavenly halberd shattered the glorious amethyst galaxy divine sword, and the 48 golden sword of no beginning shattered. The heavenly halberd then pierced into Zhuowen's chest. Blood gushed out, forming a blood pillar. The king's spirit's right hand spun the halberd, and Zhuowen's body exploded into a cloud of blood. Inside the cloud of blood, the king's spirit's right hand grabbed the ring. Trash is trash. You can't even withstand a single blow. The king's spirit's eyes were full of pride, and he did not care about Zhuowen's body. Instead, he focused on the ring in his hand. This was because there was a high possibility that the blood of the way of the heavens was in the spiritual ring. After calming himself down, the king's spirit started to refine the spirit ring and erased all traces of Zhuowen from it. Opening the spirit ring, the king's spirit's divine sense entered the spirit ring, and his breathing quickened. Inside the ring, he found many treasures that made him excited. There were level 9 divine pills, godly medicines, and dozens of barrels of heavenly star essence. Every single item in here was enough to cause countless old monsters in the Qingyun realm to fight over them. This little bastard got a lot of treasures in the Luo God Palace. I'm going to be rich this time. The king's spirit's eyes were red with excitement, and his attention was drawn to a corner of the ring. There was a very inconspicuous gilded disc, and inside the gilded disc was a pool of blue liquid. The reason the king's spirit noticed the gilded disc in the corner was because of the blue liquid it was emitting. The aura was like a mountain collapsing, and the king's spirit could not breathe. Facing the blue liquid in the gilded disc, it was as if he was facing a god that he could only look up to. He could only worship it and not profane it. This is sky path blood. The king's spirit's body trembled, and his eyes shone. The king's spirit took out the golden disc from his spirit ring. Even though the blood of sky's power was terrifying, the king's spirit didn't care. He took out the golden disc and looked at the blood of sky in front of him. Sky path blood. When I reach the 8th step of the Void Sky Bridge, I will be able to use the sky path blood to break through the shackles and reach the 9th step of the Void Sky Bridge. The king's spirit held the golden disc and laughed, but he did not notice the blue bloodlines on the surface of the golden disc. They were attached to the king's spirit's hands. The blue bloodlines were very fast, and they spread through the king's spirit's body. The king's spirit felt something was wrong, and when he saw the blue bloodlines on his hands, he quickly threw the golden disc away. But what made the king's spirit's heart go cold was that the golden disc seemed to have taken root in his hands, and he could not get rid of it. The king's spirit also noticed that as the blue bloodlines spread through his body, a chill ran through his body, and his movements became slow and stiff. At that moment, the king's spirit realized that he had been tricked. While the king's spirit's body was stiff, a wind-breaking sound was heard. It was very fast, and it was aimed at the king's spirit's vitals. The king's spirit's hair stood on end, and his body moved to the side. A purple sword pierced his left rib, and blood splattered everywhere. The king's spirit used all of his god powers to see Zhuo Wen, who was wielding a purple sword. He couldn't believe what he was seeing and he shouted, "How is that possible? Why aren't you dead?" Zhuo Wen raised his sword and looked down at the king's spirit. He laughed coldly and said, "Look at your hands. Do you really have sky blood on them?" The king's spirit looked down and saw that Han Sen was no longer holding the gilded disc. Instead, there was an ice lotus in his hand. The ice lotus was incredibly cold, and it was eating away at the king's spirit's body. It was slowing down its movements. The lower half of the king's spirit's body had become an ice sculpture. As the cold air continued to rise, the upper half of the king's spirit's body began to freeze. "What is this? Why is it so cold?" The king's spirit's eyes narrowed to the size of a needle. He tried to use his god powers to break the ice, but it was useless. His feet were rooted to the ground, and he could not move an inch. Tisk, there's no need to struggle. I've personally experienced how frightening this ice lotus is. Even though you're strong, you'll only be able to struggle free from this ice lotus," said an eerie voice. The king's spirit turned around and saw a transparent defiant walking toward them. His face was full of mockery and ferocity. "Defiant, I didn't expect you to break free from Yao Xiong's bindings," the king's spirit said. The defiant shook his head and said, "Yao Xiong's bindings? That was just a show for you to see. If Yao Xiong really wanted to tie me up, I really wouldn't have been able to break free." "What do you mean?" The king's spirit had a bad feeling about this. "Don't waste your time talking to him. Brother Yao is going to get the sky blood. Then he'll free you and allow you to leave Luo God Palace. And I'll get half of Luo God Palace's resources. What's the point of talking to this evil king's spirit?" Zhuo Wen, who was holding the purple sword, looked impatient. The purple sword sliced through the air and flew towards the emperor spirit's forehead. Suddenly, the sound of a horse's hooves could be heard. A pitch-black horse appeared in front of the king's spirit. Then, the black horse let out a cry and exploded. Black lightning came out of the black horse's body and entered the king's spirit's body. In an instant, the king's spirit was filled with black lightning. The ice around him broke, and he regained his freedom of movement. Peng! The king's spirit kicked Zhuan in the chest. Zhuan grunted and slammed into the wall. "Do you think this cheap trick will work?" The king's spirit grunted and continued to move towards Zhuan. Although his hands were still bound by the ice lotus, his power had increased. The ice lotus cold air did not affect him much. "Brother Yao, do something." Zhuo Wen's face was filled with terror as he involuntarily shouted. The king's spirit's body trembled, and his eyes became gloomy. He did not believe Yao Xiong would work with Zhuowen and the Defiant. After all, he had worked with Yao Xiong a few times, and he knew what kind of person Yao Xiong was. Peng. Unfortunately, before the king's spirit could even get close to Zhuowen, a frightening wind came from his palm, and it hit the king's spirit's waist. The king's spirit's eyes narrowed, and he coughed up blood. He was slammed into the wall. The king's spirit's eyes were cold as he looked at the man who had attacked him. The man was wearing a golden robe, and the king's spirit was very familiar with him. It was Yao Xiong. The king's spirit's eyes were red, and he stared at Yao Xiong. He shouted, "Yao Xiong, you have been using me all this time. Do you want to die?" The king's spirit roared, and his power exploded. On his chest, a red symbol appeared. Clearly, the king's spirit had used a secret skill that could increase his power for a short time. As for the ice lotuses on his hands, they were also forcibly broken free from him. Peng. The king's spirit stepped forward, and the entire wall was crushed. He ran towards Yao Xiong like a cheetah. Yao Xiong looked cold, and he was not afraid of the king's spirit. Chapter 2098. The king's spirit's killing intent. The king's spirit was fast, and it disappeared from where it stood. When the king's spirit left, Yao Xiong, who was wearing a golden robe, sighed in relief. He said, "Luckily, the king's spirit didn't see through my disguise. Otherwise, I'd be in trouble." After Yao Xiong finished speaking, he took off an almost transparent mask on his face with his right hand, revealing a youthful face that was quite pleasing to the eye. The young man was none other than the black-clothed Zhuan. Zhuan had planned to kill the king's spirit, but something unexpected had happened. He hadn't expected the king's spirit to be so powerful. If Zhuowen used his trump card to fight the king's spirit, the chances of him winning would be 50-50. There was a good chance they'd both end up injured. He might have even sacrificed one of his clones. Yun had decided to have the black-clothed Zhuowen pretend to be Yao Xiong. He wanted the king's spirit to think that Yao Xiong had been using him. Although the process had been difficult, it had still worked. The king's spirit had been forced to use a secret skill, and the side effects would be great. The king's spirit would hate Yao Xiong. If they met again, they'd fight. Zhuowen walked up to the Defiant and asked, "Where is the king's spirit now?" The Defiant smiled and waved his sleeves. The transparent veins on his chest began to intertwine, forming a red pattern. If one looked closely, they could see that the red pattern was a map of a certain location. This map was the map of the entire interior of the ruins. The king's spirit is here, and Yao Xiong is here. They are almost opposite each other. It will be difficult to meet them. The Defiant pointed at the two red dots on the pattern. "Can we let them meet?" Zhuowen looked at the Defiant. He knew that the man had absolute control over the Luo God Palace ruins. If he hadn't held back and entered the ruins, he would have been killed by the Defiant. Thinking of this, Yun felt a chill run down his spine. Fortunately, Yun had been careful. He'd taken the blood of the sky, and he'd taken control of the Defiant and Martyr. The Dao Defiant spoke proudly, "Yes. These ruins have always been operating under the control of my illusions. So, even an expert in the Tao of formations would probably be affected and controlled by me upon entering these ruins." Then let the two of them meet. As long as the two of them start fighting each other, I will take action to finish them off, Zhuowen said with a cold look in his eyes. The Defiant nodded and said, "The king's spirit used a secret skill to increase his power. The side effects. He's tired. He won't be able to defeat Yao Xiong." Yao Xiong is only at the 6th step of the Void Sky realm, but the king's spirit is at the peak of the 7th step. Even if the king's spirit is injured, it won't be easy for Yao Xiong to kill him, right? Zhuowen said with surprise. The Defiant shook his head and said, "You haven't fought Yao Xiong, so you don't know how terrifying he is. Besides, Yao Xiong isn't simple. He's noticed the strangeness of the ruins, and he's trying to break through my illusion. If he really does encounter an injured king's spirit, then the king's spirit has the highest chance of dying." Zhuowen frowned. He thought for a moment, and then he took out 2 drops of Heavenly Domain Starry Essence and said, "Put these 2 drops of Heavenly Domain Starry Essence where the king's spirit must pass, and then let them meet." The Defiant took a deep look at Zhuowen. When Zhuowen was in the formless formation, the Defiant knew that Zhuowen had an extremely large amount of Heavenly Domain Starry Essence, so he wasn't surprised that Zhuowen had taken out 2 drops of Heavenly Domain Starry Essence. "All right, I'll ask the Martyr to take it to where the king's spirit must pass." As he spoke, the Defiant passed the jade bottle that contained the 2 drops of Heavenly Domain Starry Essence to one of the Martyrs behind him. After that, the Martyr walked towards the rock wall at the side with a blank expression, and then his entire body fused into the rock wall like a weak stream of water. It wasn't long before the Martyr appeared by the Defiant's side once more. Obviously, he'd placed the Heavenly Domain Starry Essence there. "It's time for a good show." The corners of Zhuowen's mouth curled up slightly as he leaned against the rock wall and muttered in a low voice. A figure that was in a rather sorry state flashed through a dark passageway, and then he stopped on a rock wall while gasping for breath with a pale countenance. "Yao Xiong, I really never expected that you've been deceiving me all this time. I'll definitely kill you once I've recovered." It was the king's spirit that had fled, and his eyes were filled with resentment at this moment. He'd suffered a great loss at the end of the passageway. First, he'd been hit by the Defiance illusion, then he'd been bound by the terrifying Ice Lotus, and then he'd been ambushed by Zhuowen. In fact, his injuries were quite serious, and he'd used a secret technique to forcibly break free from the Ice Lotus. It could be said that his injuries had worsened. If Yao Xiong hadn't appeared, the king's spirit might have tried to kill Zhuowen even at the cost of his injuries. But Yao Xiong had appeared, so he'd retreated at that moment. Although Yao Xiong's cultivation was lower than his, the king's spirit knew that Yao Xiong couldn't be compared to an ordinary Void Sky Luding. Yao Xiong was much stronger than the Void Sky Luding, and he had many trump cards. Even if the king's spirit was at his peak, he wasn't 100% sure that he could kill Yao Xiong. At that time, the king's spirit's injuries were too severe, and if he couldn't kill Yao Xiong in one blow, he would have died there. So, after weighing the pros and cons, the king's spirit finally retreated. Once his injuries were healed, he would settle the previous debt with Yao Xiong. And that little bastard Zhuowen. I didn't expect that bastard to be in cahoots with Yao Xiong. They were just putting on a show right from the start. I almost believed them. My poor Black Lightning fell just like that. Thinking of the black horse that had accompanied him for thousands of years, the king's spirit's heart ached. King's spirit slowly leaned against the wall and placed his right hand on the wall behind him. He frowned. Huh. The king's spirit felt a bump in his right hand. He gently pressed the bump, and the bump sank into the wall. On his right, a secret door that was several feet wide appeared. Inside the secret door, a sparkling and translucent jade bottle was quietly placed inside. The king's spirit looked at the jade bottle and said to himself, Yao Xiong and I have been searching the ruins for 5 or 6 days, but we didn't find anything. Now that we're alone, I'm surprised I've come across something like this. I don't know what's inside. The king's spirit was a little cautious. He picked up the jade bottle and opened the cork. Then, a surge of medicinal power rushed into the sky. This medicinal power was very strange. At the top of the passage, a huge shadow appeared. Countless galaxies were arranged. It was a spectacular sight. Heavenly star essence. The king's spirit trembled. He was stunned. Then he raised his head and laughed. His eyes were full of ecstasy. I didn't expect it to be the heavenly star essence. I really didn't expect it. God is helping me. The king's spirit's eyes were cold. Yao Xiong, you deceived me. I, the king's spirit, will not let this go. No wonder when we searched the ruins for treasures, we didn't find anything. It seems that we were tricked by you. The real good things have been taken by Zhuon. Then the two of you will share the loot. Even the heavenly blood has been taken by the two of you. Today I, the king's spirit, can get the heavenly star essence. If I don't kill you, the heavens will not forgive me. After saying that, the king's spirit snorted and took a drop of heavenly star essence. He felt refreshed and his injuries were instantly healed. The heavenly star essence is worthy of its name. It can really heal injuries in an instant. The king's spirit carefully put away the jade bottle. There was still a drop of heavenly star essence in it. He must keep it safe. If his life was hanging by a thread, this thing could be a life-saving straw. Yao Xiong, Zhuon, don't let me find you here. Otherwise, I'll make you die a horrible death. The king's spirit's eyes were like frost. Like a flash of lightning in the dark night, he quickly swept forward. His overbearing divine sense swept around unscrupulously. At this moment, the king's spirit's cultivation had been restored to its peak. Even if Yao Xiong was not simple, the king's spirit was not afraid. And with the drop of heavenly star essence in his possession, he was even more fearless. The king's spirit returned to the place where Zhuon had attacked him, but found that Zhuon and Yao Xiong were no longer there. Let's leave this passage first. The king's spirit whispered in a low voice. There were dozens of passages in front of him. This was where he and Yao Xiong had parted ways. If the king's spirit wanted to find Yao Xiong and Zhuon, he would have to go to other passages. The king's spirit even suspected that Yao Xiong had the secret passage in the ruins. Thinking of this, the king's spirit suspected that Yao Xiong had been playing with him all this time. The real good things had been taken by Yao Xiong, and the heavenly blood was no exception. When the king's spirit came out of the passage and arrived at the intersection, his eyes immediately fell on a man in a golden brocade robe not far in front of him. The man in the golden brocade robe was none other than Yao Xiong. Yao Xiong also noticed the king's spirit, and just as he was about to greet him, he saw the king's spirit's eyes. He frowned and looked puzzled. Brother D, you just came out. I didn't find anything in the passage before. What did you find? Although Yao Xiong was surprised by the king's spirit's strange behavior, he still asked politely. Chapter 2098. The king's spirit's killing intent. The king's spirit was fast, and it disappeared from where it stood. When the king's spirit left, Yao Xiong, who was wearing a golden robe, sighed in relief. He said, "Luckily, the king's spirit didn't see through my disguise. Otherwise, I'd be in trouble." After Yao Xiong finished speaking, he took off an almost transparent mask on his face with his right hand, revealing a youthful face that was quite pleasing to the eye. The young man was none other than the black-clothed Zhuan. Zhuan had planned to kill the king's spirit, but something unexpected had happened. He hadn't expected the king's spirit to be so powerful. If Zhuan used his trump card to fight the king's spirit, the chances of him winning would be 50-50. There was a good chance they'd both end up injured. He might have even sacrificed one of his clones. Yun had decided to have the black-clothed Zhuan pretend to be Yao Xiong. He wanted the king's spirit to think that Yao Xiong had been using him. Although the process had been difficult, it had still worked. The king's spirit had been forced to use a secret skill, and the side effects would be great. The king's spirit would hate Yao Xiong. If they met again, they'd fight. Zhuan walked up to the Defiant and asked, "Where is the king's spirit now?" The Defiant smiled and waved his sleeves. The transparent veins on his chest began to intertwine, forming a red pattern. If one looked closely, they could see that the red pattern was a map of a certain location. This map was the map of the entire interior of the ruins. The king's spirit is here, and Yao Xiong is here. They are almost opposite each other. It will be difficult to meet them. The Defiant pointed at the two red dots on the pattern. "Can we let them meet?" Zhuan looked at the Defiant. He knew that the man had absolute control over the Luo God Palace ruins. If he hadn't held back and entered the ruins, he would have been killed by the Defiant. Thinking of this, Yun felt a chill run down his spine. Fortunately, Yun had been careful. He'd taken the blood of the sky, and he'd taken control of the Defiant and Martyr. The Tao Defiant spoke proudly, "Yes. These ruins have always been operating under the control of my illusions. So, even an expert in the Tao of formations would probably be affected and controlled by me upon entering these ruins." Then let the two of them meet. As long as the two of them start fighting each other, I will take action to finish them off, Zhuan said with a cold look in his eyes. The Defiant nodded and said, "The king's spirit used a secret skill to increase his power. The side effects. He's tired. He won't be able to defeat Yao Xiong." Yao Xiong is only at the 6th step of the Void Sky realm, but the king's spirit is at the peak of the 7th step. However, the golden shield remained unmoved like a mountain. The king's spirit's eyes flashed with anger. He slapped the halberd with his right hand and stomped the ground with his right foot. The ground beneath the king's spirit's feet was unable to withstand the power of the king's spirit, and it cracked open like an abyss. Bang! 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 The halberd landed on the golden shield like lightning, and the halberd's black light began to explode. In an instant, the entire hallway was dyed black, as if it had been plunged into darkness. Then, the hallway collapsed. In the deep darkness, there were countless halberd shadows. They were like fish in the sea. They flew and gathered on the golden shield. Catch it! There was a crisp cracking sound, and countless cracks appeared on the surface of the golden shield. Bang! Soon after, the golden shield was completely shattered. A blazing blade light slashed out the moment the golden shield was shattered. It was like a crescent moon that soared into the sky. The king's spirit's eyes narrowed. He waved his right hand, and the halberd slashed across the sky. It drew a horizontal line in the air and hit the crescent moon blade light. The horrible collision transmitted to the hallway, and finally, it was completely destroyed. The king's spirit jumped up and through the hole in the hallway. He looked down at the ruins of the Luo God Palace with cold eyes. Not long after, another figure broke out of the ground. It was Yao Xiong, dressed in golden brocade robes. Yao Xiong held a golden blade. The blade's surface was covered with strange runes. The golden light was dazzling, as if there was a sun embedded in the blade. It constantly emitted a dazzling golden light. "Your blade is a secondary sky-breaking divine artifact?" The king's spirit's eyes fell on the golden blade in Yao Xiong's hand. He could feel that the blade in Yao Xiong's hand was much more terrifying than an ordinary void sky divine artifact. The halberd in the king's spirit's hand was a top-grade void sky divine artifact, but compared to Yao Xiong's golden blade, it paled in comparison. Therefore, the king's spirit guessed that Yao Xiong's golden blade was a secondary sky-breaking divine artifact. Divine artifacts were divided into Empyrean divine artifacts, true divine artifacts, void sky divine artifacts, and the legendary sky-breaking divine artifacts. Of course, there was a difference in quality between each level. The halberd in the king's spirit's hand was a top-grade void sky divine artifact. It was the highest quality void sky divine artifact. However, above void sky divine artifacts was the sky-breaking divine artifact. It was said that sky-breaking divine artifacts were not man-made. Instead, they were powerful divine artifacts evolved from the heavenly Tao. They were powerful enough to kill any void sky cultivator. Even a void sky ninth step expert who had transcended life and death would be defeated by a sky-breaking divine artifact. Sky-breaking divine artifacts were legendary divine artifacts. Even the rulers of the eight heavens had never seen one. However, there was another divine artifact between void sky divine artifacts and sky-breaking divine artifacts. It was the secondary sky-breaking divine artifact that the king's spirit had mentioned. Secondary sky-breaking divine artifacts were superior to void sky divine artifacts. However, their power was far inferior to sky-breaking divine artifacts. The formation of a secondary heaven-breaking divine artifact was not fixed. It could be a secondary heaven-breaking divine artifact that evolved from a supreme-grade void heaven artifact, or it could be a secondary heaven-breaking divine artifact that was formed naturally. Therefore, there were many different reasons for the formation of secondary sky-breaking divine artifacts. Yao Xiong's gaze turned cold. The reason he was not afraid of the king's spirit despite his void sky sixth step cultivation was because of the golden saber in his hand. Yao Xiong had obtained the golden saber by accident in a dangerous place. It was not man-made, but formed naturally. After obtaining the golden saber, Yao Xiong had hired many skilled craftsmen to craft it. He had even hired powerful arcana masters to add many powerful restrictions to the golden saber. Strictly speaking, the golden saber was not a secondary sky-breaking divine artifact. When Yao Xiong had obtained the golden saber, it had not completely evolved. Its power was still much stronger than a top-grade void sky divine artifact. After Yao Xiong had refined the golden saber, it had become even more powerful. It was not far from becoming a secondary sky-breaking divine artifact. Although the golden saber had not completely evolved into a secondary sky-breaking divine artifact, its power was not something the king's spirit's halberd could compare to. To put it bluntly, Yao Xiong's golden saber was enough to close the gap between him and the king's spirit. Brother D, this Yao has never done anything to let you down. Why did you try to kill this Yao when you met me? Can you give me a reasonable explanation? Yao Xiong was furious, but he forced himself to calm down. He asked the king's spirit, "What do you think?" The king's spirit looked at the golden saber in Yao Xiong's hand and sneered, "Don't you know what you have done? How dare you try to deny it? How ridiculous! Don't think you are so great just because you have a secondary sky-breaking divine artifact. I'm not afraid of you." After saying that, the king's spirit kicked the ground with his right foot and charged towards Yao Xiong. The king's spirit was not afraid. He still had a drop of heavenly domain star essence, which meant that he could afford to be injured again. With his cultivation level, if he used the secret technique again, he was confident that he could defeat Yao Xiong. This time, the king's spirit did not only want revenge, but he also wanted Yao Xiong's treasures. Especially the golden saber in Yao Xiong's hand and the heavenly path blood. Yao Xiong didn't understand, but he could see the greed in the king's spirit's eyes, and it made him feel cold. "It seems like you want my golden saber? Since that's the case, don't blame this Yao for what happens next." Yao Xiong shouted as he stepped out into the void. He swung the golden saber in his hand, and golden light burst out in all directions. It actually manifested the shadows of golden suns. At this moment, Yao Xiong was surrounded by countless golden suns. He was like an invincible god in golden armor. Bang, bang, bang. In an instant, the two of them collided again. The terrifying saber and halberd collided, creating a deafening sound. The two of them fought fiercely. The sky changed color and the earth cracked. Both of them had terrifying battle prowess of the void sky realm. The power of each of their moves was enough to kill an ordinary void sky cultivator. The two of them fought from the sky to the ground, and from the ground to the sky. The ruins of the Luo god palace were destroyed beyond recognition. On the other hand, the Luo god statue was completely undamaged from the battle between the two of them. There was a powerful seal around the Luo god statue that blocked the shockwaves from the battle between the two of them. The two of them fought for an entire day and night. Suddenly, a figure flew out in a rather sorry state and smashed heavily onto the ground. The figure was the king's spirit with the heavenly halberd. The king's spirit's face was pale. He spat out a mouthful of blood and struggled to climb out of the ground. Yao Xiong, who was in the sky, retreated a few hundred feet. He held his chest with his right hand and panted. Although he was injured, he was much better than the king's spirit. Chapter 2100. Profit from a quarrel. The king's spirit laughed coldly and said, "What happened? Don't you know it yourself? You actually dare to question me?" Yao Xiong frowned, and he knew something was wrong. Just as he was about to speak, the king's spirit cast a spell and hit himself in the chest. A red mark appeared on the king's spirit's chest. The king's spirit's power increased by 1,000 times. It broke through 7 times and reached 8 times. Yao Xiong's expression changed greatly as he roared, "You're crazy. You actually used a secret technique to increase your strength. At that time, both of us will suffer. You're courting death." The corners of the Emperor Spirit's mouth were covered in a cold smile as he said, "I presume that Jun and the Tao Defiance are hiding nearby, right? After I get rid of you, I won't let those two off either." The king's spirit was confident that he still had a drop of heavenly star marrow, so he had one more chance to return to his peak. Compared to Zhuowen and the Tao Defiance, the Emperor Spirit was even more afraid of Yao Xiong. As long as he could get rid of Yao Xiong and obtain his golden saber, so what if he used the secret technique? After he obtained the golden saber, his strength would definitely rise explosively. At that time, once he consumed the heavenly domain Starsky essence, then Jun and the Tao Defiance would be nothing but ants that he could annihilate with a wave of his hand. Yao Xiong wished to say something more, but the king's spirit stomped on the ground and cracked it. 9 songs ghost halberd. The king's spirit shouted, and the halberd in his hand split into 9 halberd shadows. Each shadow twisted and turned into a ghostly shadow. 9 different ghostly shadows surrounded the king's spirit, and a chilling aura emanated from it. It was as if Han Sen had been plunged into the depths of a ghost town. This lunatic doesn't want to live anymore. Yao Xiong cursed in his heart. He had no choice but to fight the king's spirit. Yao Xiong swung the golden saber in his right hand. The golden light was like an upside-down waterfall, surging up from the ground and forming a huge waterfall high in the sky like the Milky Way in the night sky. Yao Xiong swung his sword 9 times, and each strike hit the 9 ghosts around the king's spirit. The gold light exploded, and the ghosts were destroyed. However, Yao Xiong was also deeply affected. With a muffled groan, he could not help but retreat. Every time he swung his blade, he would take a step back. In the air, he retreated a total of 9 steps before he finally stopped himself. At this moment, Yao Xiong was at his weakest. The king's spirit's eyes shone with a light that had never been seen before. He gripped the halberd tightly, twisted his waist, and thrust it towards Yao Xiong's body. Yao Xiong was exhausted. Seeing the king's spirit's halberd coming for him, he roared and swung his golden knife to change the direction of the halberd by 30 degrees. Puchi! Fresh blood spurted out as the halberd pierced through Yao Xiong's left rib and came out from his back. Die! The king's spirit's face was pale. His secret skill was powerful, but the side effects were terrifying. He felt powerless. Yao Xiong's eyes flashed with anger. If the king's spirit wanted to kill him, how could he not fight back? Yao Xiong pulled out a black stone from his spirit ring and threw it at the king's spirit. When the black stone left his hand, its surface lit up with countless golden runes. The runes then separated themselves from the stone and turned into thin golden threads that wrapped around the king's spirit. The king's spirit's eyes narrowed, but he did not pull out the halberd. Instead, he channeled his power into the halberd. Suddenly, the surface of the halberd shone with a ghostly light. The ghostly light was like the sharpest blade in the world. It pierced Yao Xiong's body and tore through it mercilessly. Puchi! Yao Xiong started to panic. He thought the king's spirit would use its halberd to block the black stone, but it didn't care. It wanted to kill Yao Xiong first. As soon as Yao Xiong thought of this, the power of the halberd exploded inside his body. He exploded into a cloud of blood mist. The moment Yao Xiong exploded into a cloud of blood mist, the golden threads from the black stone wrapped around the king's spirit and tightened. When the golden threads wrapped around him, the king's spirit took out the celestial star essence he had prepared and put it in his mouth. Boom! The golden threads exploded, and then more explosions followed. The explosions were getting more and more intense. Most of the places in the cloudy sky could feel the tremors of the explosions. The explosion didn't last long, and it was quickly broken by the halberd. The king's spirit walked out of the broken golden threads, holding the sky-piercer halberd. He looked at Yao Xiong, who was regenerating his body. At that moment, Yao Xiong's whole body had become a cloud of blood mist. A gigantic illusory heavenly bridge floated above Yao Xiong, and waves of energy flowed into the bloody mist, causing Yao Xiong's body to gradually recover. There was already a trace of an embryonic form. Brother D, this is all a misunderstanding. Don't do anything stupid. Yao Xiong's soul, which was floating above his body, saw the king's spirit walk out of the golden threads. He was scared out of his wits. Yao Xiong thought the golden threads were strong enough to kill the king's spirit. But now, the king's spirit was not dead. Yao Xiong did not understand how the king's spirit had managed to do this. Brother D, if you want this sword, I can give it to you. It is called the Supreme Shining Sun Sword. It is very close to being a sky-breaking weapon. Yao Xiong quickly threw the golden sword to the king's spirit and retreated with the cloudy sky bridge. His body was still being regenerated by the cloudy sky bridge, and he could not fight. If the king's spirit wanted to destroy his cloudy sky bridge, he would die. He could only stall for time. The king's spirit took the golden sword and waved it around. He laughed and said, "Good sword. Brother D, you are right. This sword is only worthy of a genius like you. It is a waste for it to be in my hands," Yao Xiong quickly said. The king's spirit looked at Yao Xiong coldly and said, "Brother Yao, it's not that I don't want to give you face. It's just that you didn't want to be nice to me first." So, Yao Xiong hurriedly said, "Brother D, you must have misunderstood something. I have been searching for the blood of heavenly Tao in the passageway. This was the first time I met you. I have not done anything to offend you." The king's spirit shook his head, and with a kick of his right foot, he flew towards Yao Xiong. Yao Xiong howled and fled into the distance. Unfortunately, Yao Xiong was too weak right now, and his injuries were far from healed. There was no way he could outrun the king's spirit. The king's spirit stepped onto Yao Xiong's cloudy sky bridge, and with a kick of his right foot, countless cracks appeared on the bridge. "King's spirit, you will die." Yao Xiong's voice was filled with hatred. Then, Yao Xiong's cloudy sky bridge exploded. The king's spirit didn't have time to dodge the explosion, and it was engulfed by the energy of the illusory bridge's explosion. When the explosion finally subsided, the king's spirit's body fell to the ground. His clothes were ragged and his face was pale. This Yao Xiong is really decisive. He blew up the cloudy sky bridge. The king's spirit's eyes were cold. Although Yao Xiong's cultivation was not as high as his, the power of the explosion was still terrifying. The king's spirit's body and mind were both damaged, and the injuries he received were not light. But this time I got lucky. With Yao Xiong's supreme shining sun blade and his spirit ring, it's not a big deal. The king's spirit opened his right hand and looked at the ring and the supreme shining sun knife. He grinned, and his eyes were filled with joy. What a wonderful fight! Suddenly, there was a clear sound of footsteps, followed by a sarcastic voice. Di Ling's face turned slightly solemn, and then he raised his head to gaze at Zhuo Wen, who was leading the Dao Defiance over. He tightened his grip on his halberd and laughed coldly. "You're really late. I've already dealt with Yao Xiong. It's utterly useless for you to come over." Zhuan shook his head and said, "On the contrary, I think I came at the right time. Yao Xiong is dead, and you're next. I think Yao Xiong won't be too lonely if you die with him. The king's spirit sneered and said, You? Even if you and Yao Xiong work together, I'm not afraid, let alone a piece of trash like you. Zhuo Wen nodded and muttered to himself, What you said makes sense. My cultivation is indeed too weak. It's good that you know it. The king's spirit sneered and jumped toward Zhuan. A mocking smile appeared on Zhuo Wen's face as he took out a black heart in his right hand. Zhuan took the black heart from the 7-poison puppet. It was the poison sac of the 7-poison puppet, and it was the main source of the 7-poison puppet's poison gas. Zhuan crushed the poison sac, and suddenly, dark green poison gas spread out like a hurricane. The king's spirit sneered. Poison gas couldn't affect him at all. He secretly mobilized his divine power and covered all the pores in his body. Then he charged toward Zhuowen without slowing down. But when the king's spirit was 10 meters away from Zhuowen, his body trembled and fell to the ground. His body twitched and his face turned green. What's going on? The king's spirit looked at Zhuowen in disbelief. Is the celestial star essence useful? Zhuowen asked the king's spirit with a smile. The king's spirit's pupils shrank as he stared at Zhuowen and shouted, How do you know about the heavenly domain star essence? Because I put the 2 drops of heavenly domain star essence there on purpose. The purpose was to let you find it. If you hadn't recovered from your injuries, you wouldn't have dared to face Yao Xiong. Of course, in order to make you more confident and firm your desire for revenge, I gave you 2 drops. This way, you will have no worries. Chapter 2101. Servant. The emperor's spirit gnashed his teeth in anger. Now that he had guessed something, he stared at Zhuowen and growled, the Yao Xiong you saw before was a fake. Didn't you kill the real Yao Xiong? Zhuowen smiled. The emperor's spirit suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. He was so angry that he realized he had been used by Zhuowen. No wonder Yao Xiong always looked confused. It turned out that the emperor's spirit had completely misunderstood Yao Xiong. Zhuowen looked at the poisoned emperor's spirit silently and felt a chill in his heart. The 2 drops of heavenly domain star essence he took out were mixed with the Saint Forbidden Divine Pill Yao Xiong gave him. The Saint Forbidden Divine Pill was said to be able to raise one's cultivation by a small level. It was extremely rare, but Zhuowen had found another corpse in the stone room and knew how terrifying the Saint Forbidden Divine Pill was. The Saint Forbidden Divine Pill itself was not poisonous, but if it was contaminated with the 7 poison puppets' poison gas, it would immediately evolve into a highly toxic poison. Then, the cultivator who took the Saint Forbidden Divine Pill would immediately die. At that time, Zhuowen also had an attitude of trying it out. He ground the Saint Forbidden Divine Pill into powder and merged it with the Heavenly Domain Star Essence. After all, the Emperor's Spirit was a Void Sky 7th Step cultivator. In Zhuowen's opinion, no matter how strong the Saint Forbidden Divine Pill's poison was, it would at most restrict the Emperor's Spirit's movements. Now it seemed that Zhuowen had really underestimated the Saint Forbidden Divine Pill's poison. The Emperor's Spirit was in excruciating pain as it died from the poison. Thinking back to when he didn't find the corpse and unknowingly took the Saint Forbidden Divine Pill, Zhuowen knew that he would be restrained by Yao Xiong. If that Yao Xiong wanted Zhuowen to die, he only needed to use the poison gas of the 7 poison puppets to make Zhuowen die from the poison and suffer unbearable pain. Thinking of this, Zhuowen's eyes flashed coldly. If Yao Xiong didn't die, Zhuowen might have made Yao Xiong suffer a little. I hate it. The monarch's spirit roared to the sky and summoned the illusory heavenly bridge, intending to self-destruct. The king's spirit was well aware of his own condition. The poison in his body was terrifying, and it had paralyzed him completely. As time passed, the poison would only become more and more terrifying. In the end, he would die from the poison. Even if he didn't die from the poison, the king's spirit knew he could do nothing but wait for death. So, he might as well blow up the bridge and take Zhuowen down with him. I have the antidote. Brother D, do you want to die just like that? The king's spirit looked at Zhuowen and said, Do you mean you won't kill me? Yes, Zhuowen said. Zhuowen chuckled, Brother D, you are a peak 7th step void sky expert. just one step away from reaching the 8th step and becoming an ancestor of your sect. Do you want to die after cultivating for so many years? The King Spirit's eyes flashed, and he looked hesitant. The reason the King Spirit was able to get to where he was today was not only because of luck, but also because of his talent and hard work. The King Spirit had cultivated for tens of thousands of years, and if he died today, it would be a waste. How could the King Spirit be willing to do that? You must have some special conditions for not killing me, right? The King Spirit calmed down and asked. Zhuan smiled and said, "Of course, there is a condition. Otherwise, why would I not kill you?" "What condition?" The King Spirit asked coldly. "Be my slave," Zhuan said coldly. "In your dreams." The King Spirit's eyes flashed with murderous intent. Zhuan continued unhurriedly, "I don't want you to be my servant forever. I want you to be my servant for 1,000 years. After 1,000 years, you will be free to go wherever you want." The King Spirit hesitated. With his proud personality, he would not easily become someone's slave. But compared to his tens of thousands of years of cultivation, the King Spirit was hesitant. He did not want to die like this, and he did not want to be someone's slave forever. He only wanted to be someone's slave for 1,000 years. 1,000 years was nothing to a powerful being like the King Spirit. It could pass in the blink of an eye. If you still think it's inappropriate, you can choose to die. I won't stop you if you want to self-destruct. Anyway, I have a lot of heavenly domain star essence. Even if you self-destruct several times, as long as I don't run out of heavenly domain star essence, I'll still be fine, Zhuan said lightly. The King Spirit looked at Zhuan and said, "I want a bottle of celestial star essence, and I will agree to be your slave for 1,000 years. What do you think?" "You are truly asking for an exorbitant price. That is fine. However, after becoming my servant, you must obey my orders. You are not allowed to disobey in the slightest. Otherwise, don't blame me for being impolite," Zhuan said coldly. The King Spirit's eyes narrowed dangerously, but Zhuan did not back down. In the end, the King Spirit nodded and said, "Okay. Now let go of your soul. I will plant a slave seal in your soul. Then I will read it for you," Zhuan said. The King Spirit frowned and sighed. In the end, he let go of his soul. He knew this was the only way he could survive. Seeing the King Spirit let go of his soul, Zhuan nodded. Then, he condensed a slave seal in the air and imprinted it into the King Spirit's forehead. A crescent-shaped golden mark appeared between the King Spirit's eyebrows. It was the mark of a slave seal. As long as the King Spirit had the slave seal, it could not resist Zhuowen's will. Otherwise, it would suffer the backlash of the slave seal. The pain was not something an ordinary cultivator could withstand. This slave imprint will automatically disappear after 1,000 years. "I think you should be able to sense it," Zhuowen said indifferently. The King Spirit did not answer. Instead, he asked coldly, "Where is the antidote?" Zhuan shrugged and said, "First, give me Yao Xiong's Supreme Shining Sun Blade and Spirit Ring." The King Spirit snorted and handed the two items to Zhuan. Zhuowen glanced at the Supreme Glorious Sun Saber with a look of amazement. The Supreme Shining Sun Blade was infinitely close to being a sky-breaking divine artifact. Its power was greater than any other void sky divine artifact. It would be a great help to him in the future. Putting away the Supreme Shining Sun Blade, Zhuan opened Yao Xiong's spirit ring and whispered, "This poison was made by Yao Xiong. I think the antidote should be in Yao Xiong's spirit ring." The King Spirit's face turned ugly. Once again, he felt like he had been played. However, he still forcefully suppressed the anger in his heart and silently watched Zhuowen rummage through Yao Xiong's spirit ring. After a while, Zhuowen pulled out a red jar from the spirit ring. Zhuowen's divine sense was extremely powerful. With a slight sweep, he basically knew what was inside the spirit ring. Zhuowen had studied the poison in the King Spirit's body. So, after rummaging through the spirit ring, he quickly found the antidote. "Take it. The antidote is in there." Zhuowen threw the red jar to the King Spirit. The King Spirit hesitated for a moment before swallowing it. After a while, the King Spirit realized the poison in his body was fading away. It seemed that the red jar really did contain the antidote. After the poison was removed, The king's spirit stood behind Zhuan without saying a word. Zhuan didn't care about the king's spirit's silence. He looked at the defiant and said, "There should be many other treasures in the Luo God Palace besides the blood of heaven, right? But I don't seem to have found anything in the ruins." The defiant's eyes flashed, but he smiled and said, "My lord, you don't know. The Luo God Palace was reduced to ruins in the war all those years ago. Most of the treasures are damaged. Even the ones that are left are basically useless after so many years." "So?" Zhuowen gazed coldly at the Tao Defiant and said, "So that's how it is. Even if there's nothing here, I still intend to enter the statue and have a look." The Defiant's face changed slightly. He knew that Zhuowen must have noticed something when the King's Spirit and Yao Xiong were fighting. After all, the entire Luo God Palace had been reduced to ruins by the shockwaves of the battle. Only the Luo God stone statue was protected by powerful restrictions. Who would believe that there was nothing good inside the stone statue? Although Zhuowen had already obtained a heaven-defying treasure like the heavenly Tao blood from the Luoshan stone statue, given Zhuowen's intelligence, he knew that the Luoshan stone statue didn't just contain the heavenly Tao blood. It also contained the foundation of the Luoshan palace. The defiant sighed and said, "My lord, there is actually another space inside the Luo God stone statue. I've never been there, so I haven't mentioned it to you." "Then take me there," On said expressionlessly. The defiant nodded and walked silently towards the Luo God stone statue. Last time, the defiant had gone through the secret door at the left foot of the statue. This time, the defiant went to the right foot of the statue. There was a secret door there as well. After the three of them entered the secret door suddenly plunged downward, in the opposite direction of the right foot's ascending direction. It only fell for the time it took half an incense stick to burn before it calmed down. The secret door opened, and a pitch-black space appeared before Zhuowen. The only light came from a ball of light at the end of the space. The ball of light glowed like a star, and it glowed silently. "What is this place?" Zhuowen asked with a frown. The defiant lowered his head and said, "This is the first time I've come here. Although I knew about this place, I've never entered it." Zhuowen asked curiously. Chapter 2102. The faceless woman. Zhuowen's eyes narrowed slightly when he heard the Tao Defiant, and he gazed at the ball of light while he became vigilant in his heart. Zhuowen gazed at the Tao Defiant and said, "You lead the way." The Tao Defiant's expression changed slightly, but he didn't dare disobey Zhuowen's orders. Now that the blood of the Heaven Tao was in Zhuowen's possession, the Tao Defiant really didn't dare act against Zhuowen at all. In the end, the Tao Defiant yielded and nodded, "Then I'll lead the way." Zhuowen heaved a sigh of relief when he saw the Tao Defiant lead the way, and then he followed slowly behind the Tao Defiant. On the other hand, the Emperor's spirit followed Zhuowen meticulously. Only the ball of light at the end of the path emanated rather brilliant white light amidst the darkness of the void. It didn't take long for the three of them to arrive before the ball of light. Zhuowen raised his head and looked over. He noticed that the ball of light was oval in shape, and its surface was covered in countless fine threads of light. Zhuowen asked, "What's that?" The Tao Defiant shook his head with a blank expression, "I don't know what it is either." Zhuowen frowned slightly, and then he suddenly sensed a strand of unusual movement from within the spirit ring. Zhuowen had a strange expression on his face when he withdrew the white jade box. He was naturally very familiar with the box because it contained the blood of the Heaven Tao. Is it related to the blood of the Heaven Tao? Zhuowen pondered in his heart, and then he hesitated for a moment before he gently opened the box. A dark blue drop of blood of the Heaven Tao flashed out from within the box, and then Zhuowen hurriedly closed the box. If he didn't close the box in time, then Zhuowen knew that the blood of the Heaven Tao within the box would probably be absorbed into the ball of light. Zhuowen's gaze descended onto the ball of light once more, and he noticed that the ball of light was actually suffused with a dark blue glow. After that, strands of blue light that seemed like veins extended towards the darkness in the surroundings. In just an instant, the entire dark space was filled with blue light. Zhuowen looked around and noticed that there were actually numerous resources within this dark blue space. There were numerous medicinal fields that surged with medicinal energy, rich veins of or that were like mountains, active weapons that floated in midair, and so on and so forth. Everything that was difficult to find in the outside world was actually here, and there were even many treasures that Zhuowen had never seen before. This should contain all of Luotian Palace's resources, right? The king's spirit asked, his eyes shining. Looks like this space needs the blood of the Heaven Dao in order to be completely illuminated. I never expected that Lord Luotian would have such a trump card. I presume it's for the revival of the Luotian Palace. The Dao Defiant sighed. Zhuowen's eyes flickered with excitement. He focused on the darkness in the distance and said, if more blood of the heavenly Dao is placed in this ball of light, does that mean that it can illuminate even more space? The Dao Defiant spirit hesitated and said with uncertainty, I'm not sure, but you can give it a try. Zhuowen took a deep breath, held the white jade box in his hand, and opened it once more. However, his gaze didn't descend onto the ball of light but onto the Dao Defiant spirit. The Dao Defiant spirit's eyes flickered, and he didn't seem to be very surprised. Bang! As soon as Zhuowen opened the box, he closed it once more. At the same time, a cold light erupted from the eyes of the Emperor Spirit who stood by Zhuowen's side. He took a step forward and smashed his fist against the Dao Defiant spirit. The Dao Defiant spirit was prepared. He clenched his fists, and countless blood-red threads instantly transformed into a blood-red mouth that blocked the Emperor Spirit's fist while the Dao Defiant spirit was blasted flying. What's the meaning of this? The Dao Defiant spirit gazed at Zhuowen with a slightly unsightly expression. As soon as the Dao Defiant finished speaking, the ball of light before Zhuowen suddenly exploded, and then the countless rays of blue light that coiled around the surface of the ball of light shot out like a rain of arrows and enveloped Zhuowen and the Emperor Spirit. Little rebel, you're really too indecisive. At the instant the blue light enveloped Zhuowen and the Emperor Spirit, a graceful figure walked out from the center of the ball of light. She wore a pink embroidered dress, was tall and slender. Her slender legs swayed slowly, and she was filled with temptation. But strangely, she didn't have any facial features. She was completely faceless. The Dao Defiant wasn't surprised when he saw her, and he said, Zhuowen is extremely cautious. That kid wouldn't have fallen for it at all if he hadn't used some sort of trick. The faceless woman spoke indifferently, he really is cautious. He clearly saw so many resources, yet he actually wasn't willing to give even more of the blood of the Heaven Dao to the ball of sacrifice. He only gave me a single drop, so I've only been able to awaken a portion of my strength. We possess so many resources, yet we're unable to utilize them at all. We're even unable to leave the area where the blood of the Heaven Dao resides. How pitiful! Both of us are unable to take the initiative to extract the blood of the Heaven Dao, but Zhuowen actually extracted it. The Dao Defiant shook his head and spoke rather helplessly, I spent so much effort to finally make Zhuowen believe that I'm a Dao Defiant that was a survivor of Luotian Palace from all those years ago. After that, I intentionally brought him here and used the resources of Luotian Palace as bait. I thought that kid would produce the blood of the Heaven Dao to completely activate the ball of sacrifice, but I never expected that all my efforts would be for naught. The faceless woman chuckled, it wasn't for naught. At the very least, I absorbed a drop of the blood of the Heaven Dao and awakened from my deep slumber. All those years ago, Luotian Palace suppressed both of us here for a few million years before it died. Perhaps it never imagined that I would be able to escape, right? The Dao Defiant nodded, and then he gazed at the faceless woman and smiled, even though you've awakened, your strength is far from recovered. That fellow, Tun, isn't simple. Can you really trap him? The faceless woman spoke with disdain, don't worry. The ball of sacrifice was created by Lord Brahma all those years ago. Once one is enveloped by the energy of the ball of sacrifice, then one's soul would be lost. At that time, one would become an unconscious martyr. The Dao Defiant was still quite worried, and he said, Zhuowen's soul is very strong. I'm afraid the ball of sacrifice wouldn't be very effective against him, right? Besides that, that kid possesses heavenly domain starry pith, so it's very difficult to kill him, right? Heavenly domain starry pith? That kid actually possesses such a precious treasure. Do you know how much he possesses? The faceless woman hurriedly asked. The Tao Defiant shook his head and said, I'm not very sure, but there are at least over 10 buckets of heavenly domain starry pith. That's quite a huge amount. That much? The faceless woman was shocked, but it wasn't long before she laughed coldly. A precious treasure like heavenly domain starry pith can only be refined by the Lord of the heavenly domain. That kid probably obtained it from Lord Brahma, right? However, the ball of sacrifice was personally refined by Lord Brahma as well, so that kid might not be able to resist the ball of sacrifice even if he possesses heavenly domain starry pith. The Tao Defiant fell silent. Even though he was still quite worried, he trusted Lord Brahma's ball of sacrifice more. After all, it had heavily injured Goddess Luo all those years ago. Even though the ball of sacrifices might have been weakened to an extremely tiny extent because of Goddess Luo and time, the Tao Defiant knew that it was more than enough to deal with a cultivator like Juan. Juan stood on the spot while he stared solemnly at the threads of blue light that revolved incessantly around him. The threads of blue light actually flashed toward Zhuowen's head, and the tips of the threads of blue light were sharp. Zhuowen knew that if these threads of blue light pierced into his head, then he would lose a layer of skin even if he didn't die. When he thought up to here, Zhuowen immediately withdrew the no-beginning devil gold swords. At the same time, he held glorious amethyst in his right hand while condensing a violet-colored sword with the energy of Tao Insight in his left hand. He suddenly slashed out with both swords while the 48 no-beginning devil gold swords condensed into a dense defense. The strange thing was that Zhuowen's attack was completely useless before these threads of blue light, and it seemed as if they were transparent as they passed through the threads of blue light. Even the 48 no-beginning devil gold swords were actually pierced through by the threads of blue light, and then Zhuowen watched in shock as the threads of blue light flashed into Zhuowen's head. Zhuowen felt a bang resound before intense pain shot through his head, and he couldn't help but roll on the ground while holding his head with both hands. This kind of pain was too terrifying. Even though Zhuowen had a strong will, he couldn't help but groan in pain. Zhuowen felt as if after the threads of blue light pierced into his head, they were constantly tearing at his soul, as if they wanted to tear his soul into pieces and take over his body. No, I have to stop these threads of blue light from entering my head. Zhuowen endured the pain and sat cross-legged on the ground, starting to circulate the stars meditation diagram. Zhuowen had always felt that this cultivation method was unusual. He was afraid that Tai Ching had specially chosen it for him, and it was extremely suitable for Zhuowen and his doppelganger to cultivate. In Zhuowen's spiritual space, endless threads of blue light appeared. These threads of blue light flashed out in an extremely domineering manner, nibbling away at the spiritual galaxies in his spiritual space, fusing them into even more threads of blue light. Explode! Chapter 2103. Breaking apart the Divine Soul Galaxy was completely shattered, forming a terrifying force that swept through the Divine Soul space. The blue light threads were endless, but they were also torn to pieces by the shattering force of the Divine Soul Galaxy. Zhuowen immediately took the heavenly domain starry sky essence, but his complexion did not improve because of the destruction of the blue light threads. Because the blue light threads from the outside continued to pour into Zhuowen's divine soul space, trying to completely control Zhuowen's divine soul, and Zhuowen could only passively resist these troublesome blue light threads. If Zhuowen really could not resist, then he could only shatter the divine soul galaxy and tear the invading blue light threads with the shattering force. Although Zhuowen had the heavenly domain starry sky essence, the impact of shattering the divine soul galaxy was not small, and it was very taxing on his mind. But Zhuowen could do nothing after all. These blue light threads were too difficult to deal with. The blue light threads invaded the divine soul again and again, and Zhuowen could only passively shatter the divine soul galaxy again, and his face soon became extremely pale. However, fortunately, the stars meditation diagram was extremely magical and had infinite possibilities. Although Zhuowen was constantly shattering the divine soul galaxy, Zhuowen's divine soul was also constantly growing stronger by relying on this magical power. In Zhuowen's divine soul space, every time the divine soul galaxy was restored, the number of galaxies would increase, and it was still increasing exponentially. Time gradually passed, and Jun stayed in it for 3 days and 3 nights. Although the time was not long, Jun had entered the gates of hell countless times. Every time the divine soul galaxy was shattered, he would die and come back alive, which was extremely uncomfortable. But his divine soul was growing very fast. At this moment, in Zhuowen's divine soul space, there were originally only 1,000 divine soul galaxies, but now there were 3,000 divine soul galaxies. And Zhuowen also used 1/10 of the heavenly domain starry sky essence in these 3 days and 3 nights, which showed how terrifying the surrounding blue light threads were and how high the attack frequency was. Zhuowen slowly opened his eyes, only to see blue threads of light flying towards him once more, wrapping around Zhuowen in an attempt to envelop Zhuowen. However, Zhuowen's eyes narrowed and flashed with a sharp light. The blue light threads that were originally entwining around him retreated one after another, not daring to approach Zhuowen. Zhuowen walked slowly through the blue light, and he used his will to find the king's spirit that was struggling against the blue light not too far away. At that moment, the king's spirit's eyes were glazed over. His calves began to become transparent, and his veins could be seen clearly. Martyr! Zhuowen looked at the king's spirit, and it reminded him of the martyr he had seen. He was sure that if he waited any longer, the king's spirit would become a martyr and become a walking corpse. It looks like the Defiant has been hiding a lot of things from me. This martyr wasn't created by the heavenly blood, it was created by this strange ball of light. Zhuowen's eyes became even colder. He stepped in front of Di Ling and pointed his finger at Di Ling's forehead. Then he released a powerful godly will. The king's spirit's body trembled, and the confusion in his eyes turned into pain. Then he regained his clarity. Zhuowen's will was now stronger than the blue light threads. The blue light threads that invaded the king's spirit's will were all destroyed. The king's spirit's eyes became clear again, and he looked at Zhuowen. Then he looked at the blue light threads around him and said, "What are these things? Why are they so scary?" My divine soul almost collapsed. The king's spirit looked at Zhuowen strangely and asked, "Did you get rid of these blue light threads?" Zhuowen laughed coldly and said, "Do you think you got rid of them all by yourself? If I hadn't come in time, you would have become a martyr." A martyr? That monster was created by the heavenly blood. "This thing isn't the heavenly blood," the king's spirit said with a frown. Zhuowen said coldly, "Do you think the Defiant's words can be trusted? Most of the information you and Yao Xiong received was fake. The Defiant must have purposely released it." The king's spirit had been practicing for a long time, and he was smarter than most people. He quickly figured out what was going on. What is the Defiant's purpose? Isn't he created by the heavenly blood? You have the heavenly blood. Isn't the Defiant afraid you'll die? The king's spirit asked with confusion. There's only a single answer, and it's that the Tao Defiants weren't telling the truth from the beginning until the end. Regardless of whether it's the Tao Defiants or the Tao Martyrs, they aren't monsters created by the blood of the Heaven Tao. I'm afraid the Defiant and the Martyr were created because of this ball of light. The reason I was drawn here is probably because I have the heavenly blood, and the ball of light needs the heavenly blood to provide energy. Zhuowen smiled coldly as he analyzed calmly, and his analysis wasn't far from the truth. The Emperor's spirit frowned and said, "If the orb of light requires the blood of the heavenly Tao, then the Tao Defiants could have taken the blood of the heavenly Tao for themselves. Why did they have to go through so much trouble to let you take the blood of the heavenly Tao and bring it here?" Zhuowen spoke indifferently, "It's very simple. The blood of the Heaven Tao restricts both Tao Defiants and Tao Martyrs. They're unable to come into contact with the blood of the Heaven Tao, and it's even to the extent that they might suffer backlash from it." Zhuowen even suspected that the Tao Defiant had noticed him a long time ago, and then he'd intentionally opened the secret door for the sake of drawing Zhuowen into the stone statue to obtain the blood of the Heaven Tao. If that's really the case, then these Tao Defiants are truly too terrifying, and they're so scheming. The killing intent in Zhuowen's eyes grew even denser when he thought up to this point. The king's spirit fell silent. Even though Zhuowen's analysis wasn't perfect, it was very reasonable. The king's spirit had felt that something was off when he'd entered this place with Yao Xiong, and now he finally knew why. They'd always thought that the Defiant and the Martyr were related to the heavenly blood, and the Defiant had never denied it. So, Juan, who possessed the heavenly blood, hadn't been on guard against the Defiant at all, and he'd been tricked by the Defiant in the end. The faceless woman and the Defiant stood side by side outside the blue thread of light, and they gazed silently at it. The Defiant glanced sideways at the faceless woman and asked, "Those two have more or less become martyrs, right?" The faceless woman's face was extremely gloomy as she stretched out her slender hands and swiftly formed seals. In an instant, the blue thread of light actually started to revolve swiftly like a tornado. "What's wrong?" The Defiant felt that something was off. The faceless woman spoke indifferently, "There was a small accident, but it'll be fine very soon." As soon as she finished speaking, terrifying rumbling resounded from within the blue thread of light, and it was like countless bombs had exploded at the same time. After that, the dense blue thread of light actually rumbled as it dispersed, and then two figures flashed out from within it and shot towards the faceless woman and the Defiant. "What's going on? They're actually fine?" The faceless woman howled sharply and immediately retreated. At the same time, she ceaselessly formed seals with her slender hands, and the blue thread of light instantly swept out like a tsunami and tried to swallow Juan. Juan grunted coldly while the 3,000 soul galaxies within his soul began to operate at the same time. In an instant, dense and invisible ripples appeared in an area of 5,000 kilometers around Juan, and the pressure in the surroundings became extremely terrifying as soon as Juan released his divine sense, and it was like a myriad of mountains were smashing down. The blue thread of light that was under the faceless woman's control had actually collapsed at the instant that Juan released his divine sense. Juan laughed coldly without end in his heart. After tempering himself for 3 days and 3 nights within the blue thread of light, Juan's divine sense had far surpassed the strange blue thread of light a long time ago. The faceless woman's attempt to use the blue thread of light against him was simply like throwing meat buns at a dog. The Defiant's expression changed drastically, and he leaped over with the intention of protecting the faceless woman. Unfortunately, there was no way the King's spirit would let the Defiant have his way. The Emperor's spirit was an expert at the peak of the 7th ascension in Void Sky, so even Juon would probably be in an extremely sorry state if he encountered the Emperor's spirit head-on, and he might not even be confident in his ability to defeat the Emperor's spirit. Even though the Defiant was formidable, there was still a gap between him and the Emperor's spirit, so the Emperor's spirit immediately suppressed the Defiant in battle. The faceless woman howled fiercely and immediately fled. Her only ability at the moment was to control the blue thread of light, but that attack was useless against Yun. She really had no other choice but to flee. Zhuowen's lips curled into a sneer, and the gigantic torch dragon wings sprouted from his back as he disappeared from where he stood. He was extremely fast, and the wind howled loudly. After a while, Yun caught up with the faceless woman, and his divine sense turned into a powerful cage that imprisoned the faceless woman in midair. The moment Zhuan imprisoned the faceless woman, the Emperor Spirit's battle also ended. The Defiant was sent flying by the Emperor Spirit's halberd, and he landed heavily on the ground not far from Zhuan. Chapter 2104. Soul Kill. The Tao Defiant had a bitter smile on the corners of his mouth. He gazed at the faceless woman and said, "Didn't I tell you? Zhuan isn't simple." The faceless woman struggled incessantly, but she was unable to struggle free at all. She spoke in a sharp and furious voice, "How could this kid be a match for me if I wasn't so heavily injured?" Zhuan gazed silently at her. He knew that she was probably the culprit who'd controlled those threads of blue light to attack him. "Tao Defiant, I'll give you one last chance. If you continue lying, then I'm truly sorry, but you'll definitely die today." Zhuan paid no further attention to the faceless woman, and he gazed murderously at the Tao Defiant who'd been pinned to the ground by the halberd. The bitterness on the Tao Defiant's face grew denser, and he sighed lightly in the end, "I'll tell you everything." The faceless woman spoke anxiously, "Little rebel, are you going to betray Master?" The Tao Defiant spoke with waning interest. "The Luotian placed a powerful curse on the extreme west a long time ago. It's a curse that the Luotian placed on the 9 ascensions of the Void Sky at the cost of his life. Master can't come here at all. Our waiting is in vain." Sacrificial maiden, it's best that you don't have any illusions. The faceless woman intended to say something, but Zhuan forcefully sealed her mouth, causing her to be unable to speak. Zhuan spoke indifferently, "Go on." The Tao Defiant glanced at Zhuan while the complicated expression in his eyes grew denser. From the beginning until the end, he'd been scheming against this young man. But every single one of his schemes had actually ended in failure. He knew that there was nothing wrong with his schemes, and the only problem was that this young man was truly too cautious. Moreover, this young man's intelligence was terrifying like a demon's. I presume you've guessed a little, right? Tao Defiance and Tao Martyrs weren't created by the blood of the Heaven Tao, and they were fostered by the sacrificial maiden's strength. Moreover, I'm not a disciple of Luotian Palace, I'm a disciple of Brahma Palace. I entered Brahma Palace with Luotian Palace after she left. The Tao Defiance spoke tirelessly about the events of the past. The rough content wasn't much different from what the Tao Defiance had said earlier. The only difference was the identities of the Tao Defiance and the identity of the Sacrificial Maiden. The Tao Defiant and Sacrificial Maiden were both disciples of Brahma Palace, and they were the only elite disciples of Brahma Palace in countless years. The Tao Defiants were relatively normal cultivators, but the Holy Maiden was extremely strange. She was born with no face, and she was abandoned by her parents when she was born before being taken away by Lord Brahma. The Sacrificial Maiden had a special kind of energy since she was young, and that was her unusually powerful divine soul. Moreover, the Sacrificial Maiden's use of divine soul had reached a level that even Great Brahma was amazed. She could even parasitize herself in a cultivator's divine soul. Back then, the Luotian goddess had agreed to Lord Brahma's request to take away the Tao Defiant, while the Sacrificial Maiden had parasitized the Tao Defiant's soul and entered the Luotian Palace together. After Luotian advanced to the Void Sky 9 steps, Great Brahma had already set his sights on Luotian's heavenly Tao blood. When Luotian came out of seclusion, she had suffered from chi deviation because she had cultivated a secret technique given by Great Brahma. At that time, the Tao Defiant had immediately informed Great Brahma, and at the same time, the Sacrificial Maiden had rushed out of the Tao Defiant's divine soul and used the energy that Great Brahma had left in the Sacrificial Maiden to launch a sneak attack on Luotian. At that time, the Sacrificial Maiden had been sealed in the ball of light by Luotian. Then, Great Brahma had appeared and attacked Luotian. What happened next was basically the same. In the end, Luotian had perished, and the Far West had become a cursed land. Great Brahma had never dared to step into the Far West again. From then on, the Far West had become a truly ownerless land. Although Great Brahma had sent many cultivators into the Far West, they had never found the true location of the Luotian Palace ruins and had left the matter unsettled in the end. This Sacrificial Maiden's attainments in divine soul are very profound. Zhuan looked at the imprisoned Sacrificial Maiden and couldn't help but recall the blue light threads that she controlled. A look of understanding appeared in his eyes. Those blue light threads targeted the soul. Now that he thought about it carefully, those blue light threads were formed from divine sense. If she wasn't heavily injured, then no matter how formidable Zhuan's soul was, he might not be a match for her. After all, she was much more proficient in utilizing her soul than Zhuan. The Tao Defiant nodded and said, "The Sacrificial Maiden was born with exceptional attainments in divine soul." "So that's how it is," Zhuan muttered softly. His right hand formed a claw and suddenly grabbed the Sacrificial Maiden's head, and then he started to forcefully invade her soul. Spurt! Both the Sacrificial Maiden and Zhuan spat out a mouthful of blood at the same time. Zhuan was even bleeding from all 7 of his orifices, and his face was ghastly pale. "You want to search my soul? Do you really think you can invade my soul just because your soul is strong? What's the point of having a strong soul? You have to know how to utilize it as well." The corners of the Sacrificial Maiden's mouth was covered in ridicule. Even though her entire body was restrained, Zhuan's divine sense invading her soul was no different than sending a lamb into the mouth of a tiger. Zhuan wasn't infuriated but delighted instead. He consumed a drop of heavenly Starsky essence and said with a smile, "Then let's do it again." As she gazed at Joan, who'd instantly recovered after consuming the heavenly Starsky essence, the sacrificial maiden's beautiful face froze, and she cursed in her heart that Joan was truly wasteful. Joan tried over and over again to invade the sacrificial maiden's soul, but he failed every single time. However, Joan wasn't discouraged. He continued to invade the sacrificial maiden's soul with his divine sense over and over again while deducing the method the sacrificial maiden utilized her soul. Bang! For hours later, the sacrificial maiden's figure shook while blood flowed from all 7 of her orifices, and her countenance was ghastly pale. Joan's eyes flickered with bright light, and then his divine sense directly poured into the depths of the sacrificial maiden's soul. The sacrificial maiden didn't resist at all. Her figure trembled, and she could only passively endure the pain of Joan's soul-searching. The soul-searching lasted for half an hour before Joan withdrew his divine sense, and his eyes revealed a look of enlightenment. This sacrificial maiden was indeed gifted. Her memories recorded many powerful methods of using the divine soul. If Joan learned these methods of utilizing the soul, the power of his divine sense would at least increase by several times. Once Joan was fighting with the enemy, he would suddenly release his divine sense attack. The opponent would inevitably be caught off guard. If he encountered a cultivator with a weak divine sense, it was possible to achieve a one-hit kill effect. The sacrificial maiden named this soul attack technique Soul Kill. Joan forcibly searched the sacrificial maiden's soul again, causing her to almost foam at the mouth. After discovering that there were no other useful memories, Joan completely erased the sacrificial maiden's soul. The sacrificial maiden was unlike ordinary cultivators. She didn't possess a void bridge, and she only cultivated her soul. The stronger her soul was, the more capable it was of killing most void sky cultivators by relying on the soul kill technique. It could be said that she was a very strange freak. Of course, Joan was a freak as well. His soul was extremely formidable as well, but he didn't possess a soul kill technique that formed its own system like the sacrificial maiden. The Tao Defiant gazed at the fallen sacrificial maiden, and his entire body trembled, yet he didn't dare make a sound as he was deeply afraid of infuriating Joan. Joan's gaze wasn't on the Tao Defiant, and it was on the boundless resources in this space instead. Moreover, his gaze was filled with burning desire. Joan flicked his sleeve and actually summoned a devouring vortex, and then a few figures walked out from within the vortex. Did something happen? The person in the lead was a couple. They were Joan's parents, Long Xiaotian and Feng Xiao. Behind them were Lu Hantian, Wu Dai, Yuan Hongwen, and the other peerless geniuses of the heavenly armor continent. After Joan continuously invested a large amount of resources over the years, their cultivation had grown rapidly, especially Lu Hantian and Yuan Hongwen. The two of them had actually broken through the Void Sky realm and reached the first step Void Sky realm. On the other hand, Long Xiaotian, Feng Xiao, and Wu Dai were slightly weaker. They were peak true god 3 disasters, and the other higher-ups were also true gods. Currently, there were many true gods on the heavenly armor planet, but there were relatively few Void Sky cultivators. There were only 2 of them. Moreover, the Z-Way galaxy in Devour's inner world was slowly developing, and many cultivators had begun to migrate to other life planets in the Z-Way galaxy. Originally, the Z-Way galaxy had become extremely desolate after Lei Qi destroyed it, but now it was much more lively. Joan smiled as he looked at Long Xiaolan and the others. He pointed at the terrifying amount of resources around him and said, "I'm afraid that our Ryuka and heavenly armor planet will really develop. These resources will be enough to nurture many Void Sky cultivators." Long Xiaotian and the others looked around, and their bodies shook. They were all stunned on the spot. Isn't that a divine herb garden? There are so many divine herbs, and there are even level 8 and level 9 divine herbs. Is that a Void Sky divine artifact? And a supreme grade Void Sky divine artifact at that. Chapter 2105. 4 Steps in the Illusionary Sky. Are these all yours? Long Xiaotian asked in disbelief as he looked at Joan. Father, gather some people and move all these resources into heavenly armor planet. If Ryuka wants to develop, we need resources. Zhuowen said with a smile. Long Xiaotian and the rest sucked in a breath of cold air when they heard these words. These resources that they did not even dare to imagine were actually brought by Zhuowen. Wasn't this a little too shocking? After regaining their senses, Long Xiaotian and the others immediately arranged for the cultivators from Heavenly Armor Planet to move the countless resources inside. This space contained all the resources of the Luotian Palace back in the day. Millions of years ago, the Luotian Palace was a giant in the far west. Even the Great Brahma Palace in the star field was wary of them. Even though they had declined because of the Great Brahma Palace, their resources were still much more than the 10 great sects in the star field. The resources that Zhuowen had brought over from the Dark Fantasy sect were not plentiful, but compared to the resources here, they were nothing. With so many resources, and the resources that Zhuowen had taken from the Dark Fantasy sect, as long as the Ryuko was given enough time, Zhuowen knew that the Ryuko would become as powerful as the 10 great sects sooner or later. Zhuowen planned to settle the Ryuka in the far west after he left this time. He wanted the Ryuka to take root here and continue to develop. After so many years of hard work, Zhuowen knew the importance of having his own power. When Zhuowen had first ventured into the star field, his foundation was too shallow, and the Ryuka was too weak then. They did not have many resources, so their development was naturally very slow. However, things were different now. Not only had Zhuowen taken from the Dark Fantasy sect, but he had also obtained many resources from the Luotian Palace. With so many resources, even a pig could become strong. Furthermore, the cultivators selected by the Ryuka were the best of the best. As long as they had enough resources, their cultivation would not be any slower than the geniuses in the star field. The king's spirit was very envious. He saw many divine medicines and skills that were suitable for him. However, the king's spirit did not dare to touch them. After all, these resources did not belong to him. They belonged to Zhuowen. Now that he was Zhuowen's servant, he did not dare to take them. Of course, with the king's spirit's arrogance, he was not going to beg Zhuowen. King's spirit, Zhuowen said. King's spirit, I see that you are not too far from the 8 steps. Zhuowen said King's spirit. Said Chen. The king's spirit's body trembled, and he looked at Zhuowen with a complicated expression. He then knelt down and said, Thank you, master. Go. I hope you can reach the 8 steps as soon as possible. Only then will you be able to help me. Zhuowen said and went to check the resources to see if there were any suitable resources for him. The king's spirit nodded and went to choose the resources he wanted. There were indeed many resources here. Long Xiaotian organized nearly 1,000 people, and it took them a few days to move all the resources into the Heavenly Armor Planet inside Devour's body. Zhuowen could use Devour's devouring power to absorb all the resources around him into his inner world. However, this would cause the resources to be piled up randomly, and some of the precious items might even be damaged. This time, the thousands of people who were mobilized were strictly categorized and carefully inspected. Among them, the highest quality resources were naturally in the hands of Zhuowen, and the rest were managed by the upper echelons of the Long family. Among the 1,000 people, Zhuowen saw some familiar faces, including Long Xiaotian. Long Xiaotian had followed Zhuowen to Middle-earth, and his innate talent wasn't bad. However, after Long Xiaotian had reached the Heavenly God realm, his cultivation had stagnated and reached a bottleneck. Seeing so many juniors surpass him, Long Xiaotian didn't feel dispirited, but he couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Even when he saw Zhuowen, his eyes became evasive. Long Xiaotian, take these 10 bottles of fire spirit juice. They can help you break through to the true God realm and increase your comprehension temporarily. When Long Xiaotian was about to enter Devour's inner world, 10 bottles of fire spirit juice appeared in his hands, and a familiar voice echoed in his head. Long Tian was bewildered as he looked at the fire spirit juice in his hand. All of a sudden, he knelt in Zhuowen's direction, bowing from a distance. Then, he excitedly entered Devour's body. After collecting the huge amount of resources, he sat on the other side and began to cultivate. Zhuowen walked to the Tao Defiant, who was still stuck in the ground by the halberd. The Tao Defiant lowered his head and smiled. Brother Zhuo, I'm not lying. Since I'm so sensible, can you let me live? Don't worry, I'm a man of my word. However, I'm curious. Can't you get out of the Luo God Palace ruins? Zhuan asked. The Tao Defiance smiled bitterly. The Tao Defiance and the martyrs have been cursed by the Luo God. They're completely lost in the Luo God Palace and can't get out for eternity. However, intruders like you can get out if you're not dead. Zhuan nodded and said indifferently, give me the exact location of the Sun Moon Lake, and I'll let you go. The Tao Defiant didn't hesitate to agree, and then he drew a map and passed it to Zhuowen. On the other hand, Zhuowen drew his halberd, and then the Tao Defiant left in panic. Seeing the Tao Defiant leave, Zhuowen knew that the Tao Defiant wouldn't dare to provoke Zhuowen again. Zhuowen looked at the Emperor's spirit, who was sitting cross-legged not far away. After hesitating for a while, he decided to cultivate here. He had a lot of resources with him. Perhaps he could rely on these resources to reach a higher level in a short time and reach the 4th level of the virtual sky realm. As for the black-clothed Zhuowen, due to the existence of the ice lotus, he didn't have to worry about the threat of the fire. He could continue cultivating here and hope that he could become true God extreme fire soon. The original body and the doppelganger sat opposite each other. The original body took out piles of resources and started to do breathing exercises to absorb the energy of the resources that surrounded him. As for the doppelganger, he took out piles of disaster crystals. In the blink of an eye, 10 years had passed. In the past 10 years, the original body of Zhuowen didn't move at all. He had been absorbing resources. Although his aura was growing stronger, he still hadn't made a breakthrough. On the other hand, the black-clothed Zhuowen had survived 5 fires during this period of time. The 15th fire, in particular, had been extremely terrifying. Fortunately, Zhuowen had the ice lotus and had survived it unscathed. That day, the original body in white opened his eyes abruptly. In the void behind him, there was a huge virtual sky bridge that appeared quietly. The original body in white leaped up and landed on the 3rd step of the virtual sky bridge. Then, his gaze landed on the 4th step that was dim. Virtual Sky Bridge 4 steps is also known as space-time disorder. When I reach the 4th step, I will be able to control the power of space-time completely. I will be able to control space-time completely, and I will be able to control space-time completely. My speed will be as fast as Torch Dragon Wings. If I were to combine it with Torch Dragon Wings, my speed will be even faster. The original body in white let out a blazing light from his eyes. He then took a step forward and landed on the 4th step. Suddenly, under the original body's feet, countless spacetimes started to distort. Zhuowen only felt that his body was being torn apart along with the distortion. Charge over! Zhuowen's eyes grew brighter and brighter like the stars in the sky. Then, he stepped on the 4th step of the virtual sky bridge. Bang bang bang! Suddenly, the space-time and time around Zhuowen stopped at the same time. The space-time around him was in a complete mess. Zhuowen's white robe fluttered in the wind as he stood on the 4th step. Although the space-time around him was in a mess, he was still as unmoving as a rock. Zhuowen leaped up. Suddenly, the space-time under his feet froze. Zhuowen's steps seemed to have transcended time and space. It seemed slow, but it was actually as fast as the speed of light. Virtual Sky Bridge 4 steps, space-time disorder, and I successfully advanced just like that. Zhuowen's mouth was full of smiles. Although the original body's cultivation wasn't high, its strength was extremely powerful. Although it was only Virtual Sky Bridge 4 steps, an ordinary Virtual Sky Bridge 6 steps might not necessarily be a match for the original body. After all, the original body had many trump cards, and it even had the powerful enhancement of the 7th level Tao Will. Zhuowen had just advanced to Virtual Sky Bridge 4 steps. Before the joy on his face faded, his expression changed slightly. He suddenly looked in the direction where Di Ling was cultivating in seclusion. At this moment, Di Ling's aura was extremely terrifying. Bolts of lightning appeared around Di Ling's body. The lightning became more and more terrifying and spread in all directions. The raging lightning condensed into a fierce and huge lightning domain. There were countless palaces in the lightning domain. It was like the immortal realm was overflowing with immortal chi. 8 steps Virtual Sky Bridge 8 steps lightning punishment? Looks like Di Ling is about to advance. Chapter 2106. Lightning punishment of the immortal realm. A gigantic illusory bridge appeared behind the Emperor's spirit. 7 steps of the King's spirit's virtual bridge were lit up, and on the 8th step, there was a huge thunder field. Lightning filled the sky, forming countless palaces of lightning that blocked the Emperor's spirit's advance. The Emperor's spirit's eyes were filled with fighting spirit. He leaped onto the 7th step and stared at the lightning field on the 8th step. Lightning punishment of the 8 steps of the immortal realm, I must succeed. The Emperor's spirit murmured. This realm was his dream, and now that he was about to break through, he couldn't help but feel excited. Rumble. The Emperor's spirit leaped into the lightning field. Suddenly, a vast amount of lightning swept over and gathered on the Emperor's spirit's body. In an instant, the Emperor's spirit's figure was completely covered by countless lightning bolts. Zhuan looked at the lightning field in silence. His heart trembled. He could feel that the lightning in the immortal realm was much more terrifying than the one he had experienced during his 20th lightning disaster. Zhuan knew that he couldn't interfere in this matter, so he just sat cross-legged on the spot and waited silently. The Emperor's spirit had told him that the 8 steps of the immortal realm was extremely dangerous. If he wasn't careful, he could be turned into ashes. If the Emperor's spirit failed this time, he might die. If he succeeded, he would reach the heavens in a single bound. The lightning became more and more terrifying. The space began to tremble, and countless spatial cracks appeared. Zhuan frowned and looked at the monarch spirit's ethereal bridge while resisting the space cracks around him. Rumble. With a terrifying explosive sound, the entire space was instantly shattered into countless pieces. Zhuan stepped on the gaps between the cracks in the space and dodged continuously. Then he darted out and left the space, appearing above the Luo god statue. At this moment, countless cracks had appeared on the surface of the Luo god statue. Even the restrictions surrounding the Luo god statue had been annihilated into nothingness at this moment. Rumble. Lightning that was like an upside-down galaxy suddenly swept out from beneath the feet of the Luo god stone statue. Like a Boston ivy, it spread out in all directions. In an instant, 90% of the Luo god palace was filled with terrifying lightning. These thunderbolts were like fine raindrops. Then, they began to interweave together, forming an incomparably huge thunder region. Within it, there were rows upon rows of palaces formed by thunderbolts. There were countless of them. Zhuan landed in a corner and silently watched all of this, and a wisp of shock arose in his heart. No wonder why cultivators at the 8th step of the Void Heaven realm were so powerful. Just the power of the breakthrough was already so terrifying. If they succeeded, their power would be enough to stun others. Although Zhuan had successfully escaped from Yuwusi, Zhuan knew very well that it was all due to luck and the heavenly domain's starry sky essence that he possessed. If it wasn't for that, Zhuan would have died 1,000 times over. Now, Zhuan was no longer the same as before. Although his cultivation was only at the 4 steps of the Void Sky realm, with his many trump cards, even the 7 steps of the Void Sky realm might not be a match for Zhuan. Zhuan might not be a match for Yuwusi at the 8 steps of the Void Sky realm, but he knew that it would be difficult for Yuwusi to kill him. Moreover, once the Emperor's spirit reached the 8 steps of the Void Sky realm, Yuwusi would have to be wary of Zhuan. Zhuan narrowed his eyes and sneered, "I still have to go back to the star field. There are some old debts that need to be settled." The lightning punishment in the immortal realm lasted for 10 days and 10 nights before it finally dissipated. The Emperor's spirit finally reached the 8th step of the Void Sky Bridge and successfully became the strongest 8 steps of the Void Sky realm. The Emperor's spirit put away the Void Sky Bridge and slowly landed in front of Zhuan. He knelt down on one knee and said respectfully, "Thank you for your gift, Master. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to reach the 8 steps of the Void Sky realm so quickly." Although the Emperor's spirit wasn't far from the 8 steps of the Void Sky realm, he had been stuck at this level for tens of thousands of years. If he didn't have a heaven-defying opportunity, it would be very difficult for him to break through. If Zhuan hadn't allowed him to choose 3 items from the Luo God Palace, the Emperor's spirit wouldn't have been able to find the herbs and other resources that were suitable for him to break through. The Emperor's spirit knew that he was Zhuowen's servant, and that Zhuan didn't have to give him any resources. He could have just worked for him for 1,000 years. However, Zhuan didn't do that. Instead, he allowed him to choose the resources in advance without any restrictions. In other words, if the Emperor's spirit took a level 9 divine herb, Zhuan wouldn't say anything. Therefore, the Emperor's spirit was very grateful for what Zhuan had done. He changed the way he addressed Zhuan, showing that he was willing to submit to him. Zhuan nodded and said, "Since you are my servant, I won't mistreat you. As long as you can do something for me in the future, I won't mistreat you." After that, Zhuan took out a jade bottle and handed it to the Emperor's spirit. "There are 5 drops of heavenly field star essence in here. Take them first. If you use them all up, I'll give you more." The Emperor's spirit took the jade bottle and felt grateful. For the first time, he felt that being Zhuowen's servant wasn't a bad thing. After all, the resources Zhuowen possessed far exceeded most of the forces in the Great Brahma domain. With so many drops of heavenly field star essence and Zhuowen's talent and strength, he would be able to shock the world in the future. Although the Emperor's spirit was proud and arrogant, he couldn't help but admire Zhuowen. In his heart, he acknowledged Zhuowen as his master. Zhuowen nodded. He knew very well that if he wanted his subordinates to work for him, not only did he need to show them power, he also needed to show them kindness and let them know that he was a reliable master. Only then would he be able to make the best use of them. "Follow me and leave the Luo God Palace." As Zhuowen spoke, he took a step forward and headed towards the Luoshan Palace ruins. The Defiant knew the Luo God Palace ruins like the back of his hand. Naturally, he knew the shortcut to the exit. Before Zhuowen had released the Tao Defiant, the Tao Defiant had drawn the route to the exit of the Luoshan Palace under Zhuowen's guidance and handed it to Zhuowen. Therefore, Zhuowen knew the exit of the Luo God Palace ruins very well. Above the white fog, Zhuowen and the Emperor's spirit floated in the air, silently looking down at the huge star below them. The two of them had just left the star, which was where the Luo God Palace ruins were located. The Emperor's spirit's gaze was complicated. Back then, the main force that entered the Luo God Palace ruins was him and Yao Xiong. Zhuowen was just an insignificant outsider. Now that they had left the Luo God Palace ruins, everything had changed. Yao Xiong was dead, and the Emperor's spirit had become a slave. The biggest winner was the young man in white in front of him. "Let's go to the ancient sword tomb," Zhuowen said and left with the Emperor's spirit. Although the Emperor's spirit was puzzled as to why Zhuowen wanted to go to the ancient sword tomb, he didn't refuse. Although the ancient sword tomb had already closed, Zhuowen naturally had his own reasons for saying so. In the star where the ancient sword tomb was located, there were still many cultivators searching for it. The entrances to the waning moon crescent were connected in all directions. Every day, there were many cultivators who ventured into the waning moon crescent. Although the ancient sword tomb was closed, there were still many secret realms on the star where it was located. Once you found something, you would be rewarded handsomely. The arrival of Zhuowen and the Emperor's spirit attracted the attention of many cultivators. The main reason was that the Emperor's spirit didn't hide his powerful aura at all. At this moment, the Emperor's spirit's body was like a raging dragon, whistling with the wind, creating a terrifying gale around him. How terrifying! This person is definitely a peerless expert. I feel that this person is even more terrifying than our sect leader. This person's aura is even stronger than Void Sky Stage 7. Could it be Void Sky Stage 8? Everyone was shocked by the Emperor Spirit's power, but many people also noticed that the Emperor Spirit was willing to follow behind the young man in white. On the other hand, the aura of this young man was only at the 4th step of the Void Sky realm. This caused the majority of the cultivators to be confused and even surprised. They really couldn't understand why an expert at the 8th step of the Void Sky realm would be so servile to a cultivator at the 4th step. Zhuowen didn't pay attention to the gazes on the star. Instead, he slowly looked at the closed ancient sword tomb. What is this person doing? The ancient sword tomb is closed. Does he want to force the sword out? Once the ancient sword tomb is closed, there will be a terrifying restriction array around it. Does this person want to die? Amidst the numerous criticisms, Zhuowen flicked his sleeve, and an extremely ordinary damaged ancient sword flashed out. The moment the rusty ancient sword flew out, the originally quiet ancient sword tomb was set off a huge wave. Chapter 2107. Sun and Moon Grass. All the cultivators in the entire star continent were dumbfounded. They raised their heads and looked at the over 9,000 ancient swords that were constantly spinning in the air with their mouths agape. Bush, bush, bush. Zhuon stood above the ancient sword tomb and used the Thousand Sword Rain's secret technique. Through the king's sword, he was able to form a connection with the 9,000 swords. It was as if Zhuon could control the 9,000 swords through the king's sword with just a thought. Zhuon knew that this was not his ability, but the king's sword's credit. The king's spirit looked at this scene in shock, and then his spirit ring began to tremble. The giant sword that he had subdued in the ancient sword tomb suddenly broke free from his control and entered the sword rain controlled by the king's sword. It wasn't just the king's spirit that was affected. Across the entire star continent, every cultivator who obtained a sword from the ancient sword tomb lost control of their swords and fell into the rain of swords. My ancient swords, what's going on? Come back, come back. For a moment, the star continent was in chaos. Zhuon stood beside the king's sword and stared at the sword rain formed by the many ancient swords. His eyes were filled with excitement. Each of the 9,000 ancient swords was extremely powerful. Now that he could control so many ancient swords through the king's sword, it was indeed gratifying. This rain of 1,000 swords would become another powerful trump card for Zhuowen. On the star continent, many cultivators could only helplessly watch the ancient swords in their bodies being summoned back. This white-clothed youth was able to control all the ancient swords in the ancient sword tomb. It was obvious that he was not someone to be trifled with. In addition, the white-clothed youth had the king's spirit by his side. Who would dare to take the initiative to provoke the white-clothed youth? Zhuon stepped on the ancient sword with his right foot and said to the king's spirit, "Let's go." Then, the ancient sword turned into a stream of light and carried Zhuon into the depths of the waning waxing moons. More than 9,000 ancient swords turned into a terrifying storm and swept over. Everywhere they passed was filled with sword qi. It was very terrifying. In the waning waxing moons, most of the cultivators who took the risk only saw the huge sword light storm and quickly retreated in fear. They were all wondering who was controlling the sword light storm. In the following period of time, a rumor spread in the waning waxing moons. This rumor was about the ancient sword tomb. The specific content was that the descendant of the ancient sword Saint King came to the ancient sword tomb, took all the ancient swords, and disappeared into the depths of the waning waxing moons. In the eyes of most cultivators, the young man in white was the descendant of the ancient sword Saint King. Otherwise, how could he control all the ancient swords in the ancient sword tomb? In the depths of the waning moons, Zhuowen stood on the emperor's sword. Around him, more than 9,000 ancient swords formed a terrifying sword light storm. The waning waxing moons were indeed dangerous, especially the deeper they went, the more giant star beasts there were. Relying on the terrifying sword light storm around him, Zhuowen was practically unstoppable. Any starry sky behemoth in front of him was swept away by the sword light storm. There are more and more giant star beasts. If I came alone, I'm afraid I would have to fight with these giant star beasts for a long time. Standing in the sword light storm, Zhuowen stared at the countless giant star beasts that were not afraid of death. He was slightly shocked, but he had already put the king's spirit into the sword light storm. The king's spirit's face was a little ugly. There were too many giant star beasts outside. If the two of them did not rely on the sword light storm, it would be difficult for them to move forward. "Master, how far are we from the Sun-Moon Lake? The deeper we go, the more giant star beasts there are, and the more powerful they are. I don't know how long the sword light storm can last." The king's spirit was a little worried. Zhuon took out the jade slip and looked at it. He said, "We're almost there." About an hour later, Zhuon and the king's spirit landed on a continent that was not very large. The continent's shape was very similar to the crescent moon. On the other side of the crescent moon was a continent that was round like the sun. In the middle of the two continents, there was a large pool. The surface of the pool reflected the moon and the sun at the same time. Zhuowen's eyes lit up. The sun-moon lake looked very similar to the sun-moon grass. It seemed that the Defiant's words were not groundless. This sun-moon lake is not simple. Master, be careful. The king's spirit looked around and noticed that the giant starry sky beasts had all disappeared after they arrived. It was as if there was some kind of monster hiding in this place that terrified the king's spirits. Zhuon also realized that something was wrong. He put away the king's sword and the other ancient swords and said to the king's spirit, "Wait for me outside. I'm going to go into the sun-moon lake to find the sun-moon grass. If anything happens, send me a message." The king's spirit nodded and agreed to do as he was told. After giving a few more instructions, Zhuowen leaped into the sun-moon lake. The water of the sun-moon lake was not clear. It was milky white, as if it was not clear water but milk. Moreover, the water of the sun-moon lake exuded a pleasant fragrance, causing Zhuowen to involuntarily drool. Zhuowen frowned. He felt that the water was very strange. He immediately covered his face and used his divine sense to replace his eyes. He plunged into the depths of the lake. The sun-moon lake was very deep. Zhuowen had been in there for 6 hours, but he still had not reached the bottom. This made Zhuowen feel that something was wrong. After diving for another 4 hours, Zhuowen still had not reached the bottom. This made Zhuowen even more gloomy. Just as Zhuowen was considering whether or not to return, his divine sense scanned the area and found that there was a woman in white not far from the bottom of the lake. What's going on? Zhuowen's heart was full of surprise. He had been diving for 10 hours, tens of thousands of meters. To find a woman in white at the bottom of this lake that was tens of thousands of meters deep, could it be a corpse? When Zhuowen tried to use his divine sense to observe the woman's face, he found that his divine sense could only observe the woman's back. No matter how he tried to use his divine sense, the result was the same. This strange scene made Zhuowen's heart sink. He knew that the woman in white was not a good person. But Zhuowen's goal was the sun-moon grass. He could not give up because of this strange woman in white. Zhuowen observed again, but he still could only see the white-robed woman's back. Furthermore, the white-robed woman was drifting in the water. After some hesitation, he did not take the initiative to go over. Instead, he continued diving downwards. After another hour or so, Zhuowen finally reached the bottom of the lake. The bottom of the lake was not much different from the bottom of an ordinary lake. There was soft sand under his feet, and there were scattered rocks around him. Zhuowen searched the bottom of the lake for a while. Suddenly, he noticed a square rock in front of him because he found that the rock just happened to be in the center of the reflection of the sun and moon in the lake. Zhuowen's eyes flickered. He rushed to the rock and took it away with his right hand. Then, he found that there was an extremely hidden groove under the rock. Inside the groove, there was actually a stalk of divine grass growing. The divine light emitted by the grass was half that of a bright moon and half that of a blazing sun. Sun-moon grass. Zhuowen took a deep breath and said these 3 words with trembling lips. His eyes were filled with ecstasy. He did not expect to find the sun-moon grass in the sun-moon lake so easily. It was really a pleasant surprise. The Tao Defiant said that the sun-moon lake is even more terrifying than the Luo God Palace ruins. Now that I think about it, besides the numerous space beasts outside, it isn't very dangerous. Zhuowen took the sun-moon grass and placed it carefully into a jade box. He recalled what the Tao Defiance had said, and he didn't think much of it. After he put the sun-moon grass away, Zhuowen turned around and swam towards the top of the sun-moon lake. But in next to no time, his figure shook and stopped on the spot like a stone statue. Zhuowen raised his head and looked up. There was a white-clothed woman's back there, and she floated there silently. Her long hair was like seaweed that fluttered with the water. Zhuowen's figure stiffened. He hadn't expected to see the white-clothed woman's back again, and a trace of terror arose in his heart. At this moment, Zhuowen used his divine sense to detect the woman once more with the intention of seeing her true appearance. However, he still noticed that he could only see her back and was unable to see her face. Zhuowen didn't act rashly and alert her. He silently moved around the woman and swam towards the top. The white-clothed woman was truly strange. Moreover, Yun had already obtained the sun moon grass, so he didn't want to cause trouble because of it. Zhuan swam upwards for 10 hours. When he reckoned that he was about to reach the surface, he noticed that he was still at the bottom of the lake. Moreover, his feet were even standing on the sand at the bottom of the lake. Chapter 2108. The white-robed woman. Zhuan was shocked as he coldly stared at the white-robed woman in front of him. He did not speak, but took out the glorious purple galaxy sword and slashed out. In front of Zhuan, the water turned into tornadoes, wreaking havoc as if the entire water droplet was overturning rivers and seas. The terrifying sword Qi swept up the raging water flow and instantly rolled up the white-robed woman, and then tore her into countless pieces. But Zhuan did not have any joy, but his face was as calm as water. He knew that the white-robed woman was not torn into pieces, but just disappeared in an instant. Kikik, a hair-raising laughter came from behind Zhuan. Behind Zhuan, the white-robed woman slowly appeared. Her back was still facing Zhuan, her black hair fluttering in the wind. Zhuan turned around, retreated dozens of steps, coldly looked at the white-robed woman, and asked, "What are you?" The white-robed woman was still laughing strangely, slowly approaching Zhuan like a shadow. Wherever she passed, the water flow was calm, without the slightest ripple. Yun felt his hair stand on end. He found that the water flow around him was like a rope, strangling his body, making him unable to break free. When the white-robed woman came in front of Zhuan, Yun found that there were more than 10 scarlet lights in the black hair. Moreover, these scarlet rays of light were extremely similar to eyes. It was as if there were more than a dozen red eyes hidden within the black hair, staring straight at Zhuan. A cold feeling rose from the bottom of Zhuan's feet, directly rushing to his Tianling point. Kikik, seeming to feel Zhuan's fear, the white-robed woman's smile became wider, and then her head with her hair draped over her shoulders slowly approached Zhuan. When Zhuan wanted to punch her away, he found that his fist was like an illusion, passing through the woman's body. At this moment, Zhuan discovered that the woman in white did not have a face at all. In front of and behind the white-robed woman, there were only silhouettes of her back. It was no wonder that no matter how Zhuan used his spiritual consciousness to scan, all he could see were silhouettes of her back. The white-clothed woman's head slowly approached Zhuan. More than 10 scarlet gazes were imprinted into Zhuan's eyes, causing Zhuan to be in a daze. "Soul kill," Zhuan murmured in his heart. The terrifying soul consciousness in his spiritual space turned into a terrifying killing force. Like an angry dragon, it rushed out from between Zhuan's eyebrows. The white-clothed woman didn't expect that Zhuan had mastered such a terrifying divine sense attack. She immediately suffered a loss. With a scream, she was sent flying. Taking advantage of the moment when the woman in white retreated, Zhuan broke free from the shackles of the water current. The torch dragon wings on his back spread out, stirring up a terrifying water current as he darted upwards. After a while, Zhuan jumped out of the Sun Moon Lake. Only now did he realize that he was not far from the water surface. The reason why he couldn't reach the water surface before was probably related to the white-clothed woman. The king's spirit was floating not far from the Sun Moon Lake. After seeing Zhuan come out, he was relieved. Just as he was about to speak, Zhuan spread out his wings and immediately flew away with the king's spirit. "What's wrong?" The king's spirit was puzzled, but soon he found that the Sun Moon Lake behind him erupted with a towering wave. The milky white water rushed up to a height of 10,000 feet. At the end of the water, only the back of the white-clothed woman stood. "Ah!" The white-clothed woman looked up to the sky and screamed. The milky white water in the Sun Moon Lake turned into countless angry dragons, sweeping out and chasing after Zhuan. The white-clothed woman stepped on one of the water currents and chased after him. Out of the range of the Sun Moon Lake, countless giant star beasts rushed over like cats smelling blood, blocking Zhuan's path. Zhuan immediately summoned the king's sword and more than 9,000 ancient swords, forming a terrifying sword light storm around him. The giant star beasts that blocked his way were all smashed into pieces by the sword light storm, and countless clouds of blood mist were particularly dazzling in the starry sky. "Master, what is that thing behind us?" The giant star beasts seemed to be afraid of that woman, the king's spirit suddenly said. Zhuan glanced behind him, and his heart sank. He saw the white-clothed woman with more than a dozen water pillars behind her, unimpeded. The rest of the giant star beasts were like avoiding a flood, and they kept retreating, not daring to get close to the white-clothed woman. Because Zhuan was blocked by the giant star beasts, his speed was naturally slower than the white-clothed woman. Zhuan knew that it would not be long before the white-clothed woman caught up with him. "King's spirit, enter my spirit ring first," Zhuan said. The king's spirit was bewildered, but he didn't hesitate, immediately entering Zhuan's spirit ring. After the king's spirit entered the spirit ring, Zhuan summoned the black-clothed Zhuan, saying, "Show me your real body. Only Devour can subdue these giant star beasts." The black-clothed Zhuan nodded, and a terrifying black aura gushed out from his body. Then, a giant phantom of a monster appeared in the black aura. The white robe of Zhuan's body fluttered as he leaped up, bringing with him a terrifying sword-light storm, and jumped onto Devour's body. The moment Devour's giant body appeared in the starry sky, an earth-shaking beast aura expanded like a tsunami. Instantly, the surrounding starry sky collapsed. Many giant star beasts that were madly attacking Zhuan fled in fright when they saw Devour's real body. Devour was a strong clan in the starry sky, which was much stronger than these giant star beasts. To these giant star beasts, Devour's aura was like a superior looking down on the inferior. They didn't dare to offend the superior. Devour stomped on the starry sky, his speed as fast as light as he disappeared from his spot. The woman in white snorted, her hands clapping. The milky white water columns around her turned into thousands of giant dragons, chasing after Devour and attacking him fiercely. Devour's eyes were dark and cold. He immediately used his innate supernatural ability, Purgatory. The power of thousands of water dragons was weakened instantly. At the same time, Devour opened his third eye, the Heavenly Thunder Eye. The extreme true lightning shot out from the Heavenly Thunder Eye. Although it wasn't powerful, its piercing power was terrifying. The moment thousands of water dragons met the extreme true lightning, they exploded into a puddle of mist. At the same time, Zhuan took out the ice lotus from his spirit ring. Using the ice lotus's terrifying cold air, he condensed the water dragon that had exploded into a mist, forming a huge white ice wall that stretched across the starry sky. The white-clothed woman was blocked outside the white wall. The moment she placed her hands on the white wall shattered into pieces. However, when the woman in white got out of the white wall, Zhuan was already gone. The woman in white faced the sky and roared angrily. Then she began to violently destroy everything around her. Every continent, asteroid, or giant star beast she saw became her target. Outside the waning yin-yang circle, Devour landed on an uninhabited continent in a deserted area. Zhuan observed for a while. After confirming that the woman in white hadn't chased after him, he exhaled and retrieved Devour. At the same time, he summoned the king's spirit from his spirit ring. "Master, what is that woman in white after all?" As soon as the king's spirit came out, he asked skeptically. Zhuan shook his head. "I don't know what she is after all. I met her when I went to the Sun and Moon Lake to collect the sun and moon grass." "Oh right, king's spirit, please protect me. I need to seclude myself to deal with something." The king's spirit was startled, but he didn't ask anything. He just nodded and said, "Master, go ahead." Zhuan nodded. He chose a canyon on this continent and set up a powerful restriction array at the entrance. At the same time, he also set up a shielding array. Only then did he feel relieved. Zhuan sat on the ground and took out a crystal coffin from his spirit ring. Through the transparent coffin lid, a woman as beautiful as a painting could be seen lying quietly in the coffin, as if she was sleeping peacefully. "Chen Shui, I have found the sun and moon grass. I can finally wake you up." Zhuan took out a jade box and carefully took out the sun and moon grass that had manifested the images of the sun and moon. He held it in front of the sleeping woman like a child showing off his favorite toy in front of an adult. He was extremely excited. "We will meet again soon. Wait a moment." Zhuowen's face was full of a gentle smile. He gently opened the lid of the coffin. Then, Zhuowen's right hand quickly pointed at the coffin. An invisible ripple spread from the surface of the coffin. It was clear that Zhuowen had placed quite a few restrictions on the coffin. It took Zhuowen more than an hour to break all the restrictions around the coffin. The main reason why Mu Chenxue was sleeping was because of the yin and yang imbalance in her soul. The sun and moon grass was a rare divine medicine that could balance the yin and yang imbalance in the soul. It was the perfect divine medicine for Mu Chenxue. Before looking for the sun and moon grass, Zhuowen had already collected information on how to use the sun and moon grass. Of course, there were many uses for the sun and moon grass and there was no fixed method. Among the many methods, Zhuowen chose the safest one, which was to place the sun and moon grass on the chest and let the sun and moon grass balance the power of the sun and moon, subtly influencing the injured person. As time passed, the sun and moon grass would gradually merge with the injured person's soul. When the sun and moon grass withered on the injured person's chest, it meant that the sun and moon grass had been completely absorbed. Normally speaking, after the sun and moon grass's power was completely absorbed, the injured person's unbalanced soul would be rebalanced. At that time, the unconscious person would naturally wake up. Chapter 2109. Carefree Palace. Of course, there were many ways to use the sun and moon herb, but most of them had side effects. Zhuowen was still worried, so he decided to use this method. Although it would take a long time, Zhuowen didn't mind. He had waited for so many years, and a few years wasn't a long time. Zhuowen slowly placed the sun and moon herb on Mu Chenxue's chest. He then held Mu Chenxue's cold hands and felt Mu Chenxue's sleeping soul. He found that as the sun and moon herb was placed on Mu Chenxue's chest, Mu Chenxue's wandering soul began to fill up and solidify. Zhuowen was overjoyed. He knew the sun and moon herb was effective. Although the solidification of the soul was slow, Zhuowen knew that as time passed, Mu Chenxue's soul would only grow stronger. Once Mu Chenxue's soul had completely recovered, it would be time for her to awaken. Zhuowen held Mu Chenxue's hand and gently placed it on his cheek. He felt Mu Chenxue's breath and whispered to her, as if he was telling a bedtime story to his wife. Holding Mu Chenxue's jade-like hand, Zhuowen only felt that his troubled heart had become as tranquil as water. Slowly, Zhuowen leaned against Mu Chenxue's side and fell asleep. This was the most peaceful and comfortable sleep Zhuowen had had in many years. The king's spirit stood outside the valley. A day later, Zhuowen emerged from the valley, looking as calm as ever. "Master!" The king's spirit stood up and respectfully approached Zhuowen. Zhuowen nodded and said, "Come with me and leave Waning Moon Crescent. I'll be leaving for the stellar region once I deal with some matters in the extreme west. Come with me then." The king's spirit nodded and said, "Yes, master." The two of them turned into a long rainbow and left cloudy, clear, round, Quebec. Zhuowen's brows furrowed slightly as he left the waxing moons and waning moons. Then, he took out a message talisman from his bosom. As soon as he left the valley, he immediately received a message from the communication talisman. Generally speaking, Zhuowen didn't know any cultivators in the far west. Apart from Ren Yanggan, Yin Bingyun, Yun Chuyu, and Hong Shan, he didn't know anyone else. These were the only 4 people who had sent him a message this time. Zhuowen checked the messages and found that most of them were from a few days ago. Furthermore, most of the messages were for help. Skimming through the messages, Zhuowen's face became gloomy. It turned out that after Zhuowen left Dupi City and came to the far west, Yin Bingyun and the others didn't follow Zhuowen's orders to leave the far west. Instead, they settled down here. In the beginning, the 4 of them were safe and sound. Instead, they were doing well in Dupi City. However, at some point, people from Carefree Palace came to Dupi City and hunted down Yin Bingyun and the others. The one who sent the message to Zhuowen was Yun Chuyu. The most recent message showed the despair of the 4. Yun Chuyu told Zhuowen not to return to Dupi City, but to go as far as he could because the people from Carefree Palace already knew that Zhuowen had killed young Master Carefree Palace. Crushing the communication talisman, Zhuowen's eyes were extremely gloomy. He looked at the king's spirit and said, "Do you know where Carefree Palace is?" The king's spirit was stunned and nodded. I know. Carefree Palace isn't far from Dubhe City. However, it's still some distance away from Dubhe City. Okay, you lead the way. Zhuan took out God Lu from his spirit ring. This was the ship he had taken from Lu Wuqi. Zhuan didn't hesitate at all. Entering God Lu, he flew toward Carefree Palace under the king's spirit's guidance. At this moment, in the inner hall of Carefree Palace, Palace Master Carefree Palace, Qian Tianjiao, sat at the head of the table. Qian Tianjiao looked to be about 50 years old. His sideburns were white, but he was full of vitality. His face was rosy and his aura was mighty. In the hall, there were 2 other people besides Qian Tianjiao. One of them was about the same age as Qian Tianjiao, but his aura was no weaker than Qian Tianjiao's. The other person was younger, tanned, and well-built. He was Fang Jin, the man Zhuan had met on God Lu. Qian Tianjiao raised the cup of tea in his right hand and toasted the 2 people in the hall. He smiled and said, "Thank you, Elder Fang, for informing me of my son's whereabouts. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't even know that my son had fallen." As he said this, Qian Tianjiao's eyes flashed with coldness and sorrow. The middle-aged man beside Fang Jin was the Xiantian Valley's Valley Master, Fang Yang, and Fang Jin's father. Fang Yang waved his hand and said, "Palace Master Qian, you're too kind. I didn't know about this either. Thank you for bringing it up. Otherwise, I wouldn't have realized that something was wrong." Qian Tianjiao raised his hand and toasted Fang Jin. He sighed and said, "Nephew Fang, it's all thanks to you." Fang Jin toasted back and said shyly, "Uncle Qian, you're too kind. When I was on God Lu, I felt like old friends at first sight. I regret not having met him sooner. But after I got off the ship, I noticed that something was wrong with Wuyo. His way of doing things was completely different from usual. I didn't take it to heart at first, but when I came to visit Carefree Palace, I noticed that Wuyo hadn't returned yet. So I became vigilant and told my father about this." Speaking up to here, Fang Jin said rather regretfully, "After capturing those 4 people, Palace Master should have conducted a soul search on them, right? What exactly is going on?" Qian Tianjiao's eyes were cold as he said, "They were 3 women and 1 man. I searched Ren Yong'an's soul and found out the truth. It turned out that my son had been killed by that bastard Zhuan on God Lu. I don't know what method that Zhuan used to disguise himself as my son and swindle people on the ship. It's really detestable." Fang Jin's eyes were cold as he said in a deep voice, "No wonder I noticed something was wrong when I got off the ship. It turns out that it wasn't the real brother Wuyo. To think that I tried so hard to invite that guy before I left. I must have been blind. I wonder where that Zhuan is now?" Fang Jin asked. Qian Tianjiao's eyes were cold as he said, "I heard that Zhuan went to Waning Crescent several years ago and hasn't returned yet. However, I found out from Ren Yong'an's memories that this Zhuan is a loyal person. So I purposely used Ren Yong'an's communication jade token to send many distress signals to Zhuan. If that Zhuan is really loyal, I'm afraid that he will take the initiative to come to Carefree Palace. At that time, I'll capture that kid in one fell swoop and make you wish you were dead." Fang Yang frowned and said, "Brother Qian, Carefree Palace's reputation in the far west isn't weak. As long as that Zhuan isn't a fool, he won't foolishly come to Carefree Palace to rescue someone, right? If I were that Zhuan, I would definitely run away." Qian Tianjiao sneered and said, "Even if that Zhuan doesn't dare to come to Carefree Palace, he will definitely return to Dubhe City to check. I've already placed many spies on the road from Waning Crescent to Dubhe City. That Zhuan must have come on the God Lu. At that time, as long as the God Lu appears, someone will immediately report." Speaking up to this point, Qian Tianjiao suddenly trembled. His eyes revealed a complex emotion of malevolence and ecstasy. "Brother Qian, what's wrong?" Fang Yang asked in surprise. The spies sent news. The God Lu has already appeared. Right now, it's heading in the direction of Dubhe City," Qian Tianjiao said with a hideous grin. Fang Yang and Fang Jin exchanged glances. They both clasped their hands and said, "Then congratulations. If that Zhuan really enters Dubhe City, he's dead for sure." The spies sent news again. "That God Lu's route isn't Dubhe City, But Carefree Palace? The smile at the corners of Qian Tianjiao's mouth instantly froze. Instead, he revealed a shocked expression. Fang Zhen and Fang Yang, the two people, also revealed strange looks. They thought to themselves, could that Zhuan be possessed? To actually head straight for Carefree Palace. Could it be that he was here to throw away his life? Just what I wanted. Brother Fang, honorable nephew Fang, this Qian will leave for a while first. I need to make arrangements, Qian Tianjiao said. Brother Qian is really too courteous. We'll go together with you too. I really want to see just what this reckless fellow looks like, Fang Yang said with a hearty laugh. Qian Tianjiao hesitated for a while, but he didn't object. Thus, the three of them left the hall. In the vast expanse of space, the enormous spacecraft swept past countless stars and asteroids, leaving behind countless of them. Zhuan stood in front of the main control panel. Through the transparent window in front of him, he silently looked at the objects in space that were rapidly passing by. The king's spirit stood behind Zhuan. His eyes flashed as he asked, Master, there were many spies along the way. Why didn't you do anything? Chapter 2110. Intimidating. The meteorite where Carefree Palace was located was about the same size as Dubhe City. There were many pavilions and endless streams of people. Most of the people on this huge meteorite were foreign cultivators who made a living or settled down here. Carefree Palace was located in the central region and was the most powerful ruler of this meteor. Dubhe City was not far from Carefree Palace. It was only a 3-day journey. At this moment, teams of powerful guards rushed out of Carefree Palace. Even Carefree Palace's fleet had been mobilized. Carefree Palace was not weak. The size of their fleet was huge, with more than 20 flying ships. These flying ships were much smaller than Zhuowen's God Lu, but they were equipped with many powerful weapons. These flying ships were combat flying ships specially used for combat, while the God Lu was mainly used for transportation, so it had a great weakness in combat. Carefree Palace Master Qian Tianjiao slowly landed in front of the fleet. Behind him were Fang Yang and Fang Zhen, as well as the higher-ups of Carefree Palace. Countless cultivators on the meteorite where Carefree Palace was located looked up at Qian Tianjiao, who had mobilized so many people. Their eyes were filled with astonishment as they discussed animatedly. Qian Tianjiao floated in the starry sky, his eyes narrowed as he waited silently. Suddenly, Qian Tianjiao opened his eyes. A fierce light flashed in his eyes, and the corners of his mouth curled into a sinister smile. Fang Yang and Fang Zhen also focused their gazes on the empty starry sky in front of them. Soon, a flying ship flew over and stopped a few thousand miles in front of the fleet. A young man in snow-white clothes slowly walked down from the flying ship. Behind him was a tall middle-aged man with an obscure aura. The young man in snow-white clothes was naturally Zhuan, and the middle-aged man was the king's spirit. At Zhuan's request, the king's spirit did not release any aura. This time, Zhuan was prepared to handle this matter himself. Unless absolutely necessary, Zhuan did not intend to let the king's spirit take action. The king's spirit naturally respected Zhuan's orders and was not worried about Zhuan. Carefree Palace's palace master, Qian Tianjiao, only had the cultivation of Void Sky 6 steps. His strength was much weaker than Yao Xiong back then. With Zhuowen's strength, it was actually not difficult to get rid of Qian Tianjiao. As for the might of Carefree Palace's fleet, it was indeed terrifying. However, such a fleet was only suitable for large-scale battles. Targeting powerful cultivators was simply too difficult. In particular, Zhuowen's speed was so fast that it had reached the terrifying level of shrinking the ground into an inch. With the flying ship being so cumbersome, it was very difficult to aim and hit Zhuan. Qian Tianjiao squinted at Zhuan and looked at the king's spirit behind Zhuan. The king's spirit's presence was subtle, but Han Sen could tell that it was not someone he should mess with. You're Zhuan? You dare to come to my Carefree Palace alone? You sure have guts, Qian Tianjiao sneered. Zhuan slowly walked over, but his eyes fell on Fang Zhen behind Qian Tianjiao. He grinned and said, Brother Fang, I trust you've been well since we last met. Ever since I left God Lu, I haven't paid a visit to Xiantian Valley. Looks like I'll have to pay a visit this time. Looking at the smile on Zhuowen's face, Fang Zhen's heart trembled. He actually felt a deep sense of fear. He was sure that this Yun was the guy who had impersonated young Master Carefree. After all, the way this guy spoke was too similar. However, Fang Zhen really didn't expect this guy's cultivation to rise so quickly. He remembered that a few years ago, this person had only reached the second step of Void Sky. Only 7 or 8 years had passed, and his cultivation had increased again, reaching the 4th step. Fang Zhen's talent was terrifying, but after 7 or 8 years, he had only managed to stabilize his cultivation at the 1st step of Void Sky. Although this Zhuowen's cultivation speed is very fast, he's only at the 4th step of Void Sky. I have many experts by my side now, so why should I be afraid of this person? Fang Zhen gave himself a dose of tranquilizer in his heart. He then looked at Zhuowen without hesitation and sneered, "You've got guts. Not only did you kill Brother Carefree, you even dared to impersonate him and played me like a fool. Today you'll die here. You still want to go to Xiantian Valley? You must be dreaming." Zhuowen smiled indifferently and said, "Keep dreaming. I think you won't think that way very soon." Qian Tianjiao's face turned ugly. This Yun had ignored him the moment he arrived, which made him angry. "Little bastard, you've got guts. You actually dared to kill my son. Did you know he was from Carefree Palace?" Qian Tianjiao suppressed the anger in his heart and asked coldly. "I knew. It's just that Carefree Palace is just a small faction to me. Is there a problem with killing the young master of such an unknown faction?" Zhuowen said slowly. His words made Qian Tianjiao's face turn green and white. He could no longer suppress the anger in his heart and roared, "Kill him! Kill him for me! No, break his limbs. I want him alive. I want him to suffer a fate worse than death. I want him to regret living in this world." Qian Tianjiao had almost lost his mind. More than a dozen high-ranking officials around him rushed toward Zhuowen. These people were not weak. The weakest was at the 3rd step of the Virtual Sky Realm, while the strongest was at the 5th step. This was the strongest lineup of Carefree Palace. Even Qian Tianjiao would have a headache if he encountered such a lineup. More than 10 people were extremely fast. They quickly arrived in front of Zhuowen. One of the cultivators at the 4th step of the Virtual Sky Realm was the fastest. He had already arrived, and the weapon in his hand was aimed at Zhuowen's vital points without any hesitation. Zhuowen revealed a cold smile. The glorious amethyst galaxy sword appeared in his hand at an unknown time. His right hand wielding the glorious amethyst galaxy sword fiercely slashed out. The sword light was like an inverted waterfall as it rushed out. Soon after, it condensed into a huge and fierce dragon of sword qi in the void. Zhuowen used the 8th move of the Tao of Destruction sword art, Sword Dragon slashing the sky. The sword qi was like a dragon, piercing through the starry sky. The cultivator at the 4th step of the Virtual Sky Realm, who was approaching with a sinister smile on his face, suddenly showed fear in his eyes. The sword dragon soared into the sky and heavily bombarded the cultivator's weapon. Then, the weapon didn't even last a breath before it was completely shattered. The gigantic sword dragon, with its terrifying sword qi, completely devoured the cultivator. Then, the cultivator's entire body exploded into a cloud of blood mist. The virtual sky bridge behind him shattered into pieces. He died just like that. The remaining cultivators at the back retreated to the side. This sword dragon was too terrifying. Puchi. Although the cultivators at the back were prepared, the sword dragon was too fast. Several cultivators were still engulfed by the sword dragon and torn to pieces. The remaining 10 cultivators were quite strong. They retreated in advance and avoided the fate of death. However, the aftermath of the sword qi emitted by the sword dragons still caused the 10 cultivators to suffer heavy injuries. How can this kid's attack be so terrifying? This shouldn't be the strength of a 4th step Virtual Sky Realm cultivator at all. After the 10 cultivators escaped death, they didn't let out a sigh of relief. Instead, a trace of fear rose in their hearts. With one sword strike, He instantly killed several cultivators of the same level and even killed 10 other virtual sky realm cultivators. What kind of strength did this require? Qian Tianjiao, who was at the front of the fleet, narrowed his eyes and trembled slightly. The sword dragon's attack just now was too terrifying. It wasn't any weaker than his full-strength attack. Moreover, looking at Zhuowen's appearance, it didn't seem to be very strenuous to use that sword strike. This made Qian Tianjiao have a bad premonition in his heart. The entire Carefree Palace was collectively stunned. Some cultivators even began to compare Zhuowen's sword dragon slashing the sky with Qian Tianjiao's and came to the conclusion that Qian Tianjiao might not be able to withstand the sword dragon's attack. Fang Zhen's eyes widened, and his jaw almost dropped. The attack just now was too shocking. He found that he couldn't even withstand the aftermath of the attack. Let's hurry and leave this place. Fang Yang suddenly transmitted his voice to Fang Zhen before he could recover his senses. Fang Zhen came back to his senses and trembled all over. Father, you and Palace Head Qian are both 6th-step virtual sky realm cultivators. Could it be that you're not Zhuowen's match? Fang Yang smiled bitterly. Do you know how terrifying that attack was? Even I can't withstand it unscathed. Moreover, that Zhuowen's face isn't red and he's not panting at all. I'm afraid that attack wasn't his full strength. Hearing this, Fang Zhen also panicked. He replied, Father, if this Zhuowen is really as terrifying as you say, do you think it's possible for him to destroy Carefree Palace? Fang Yang sighed softly, I think that's possible. The middle-aged man behind this young man isn't simple at all. His cultivation base can only be higher than Zhuowen's. This time, the Carefree Palace has kicked an iron plate. We have to immediately cut ties with Qian Tianjiao. Fang Zhen's face was bitter. How can we cut ties with him? That Zhuowen said before that he will visit our Xiantian Valley. I'm afraid he won't let us go. Fang Yang, on the other hand, replied calmly, not necessarily. The main reason this brat came to Ashoka Palace is because Qian Tianjiao captured his companions. It has little to do with us. As long as we apologize to him, I believe this brat will not make an enemy out of us. Fang Zhen nodded. Then, the father and son slowly retreated from the battlefield, planning to leave. However, not long after the father and son left, they were stopped by the monarch spirit. A terrifying pressure pressed down on them. Fang Yang and Fang Zhen trembled and shouted in their hearts, 8 steps virtual sky. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.